Hello and welcome everyone to another live stream. Today I am going to be looking at a video by Sean McDowell. It's a little while, I think, since I responded to one of his videos. But before we get to that, I have a couple of announcements, I guess, or business items. So one is this fundraiser that Nathan set up for me. Which I just wanted to draw to your attention. So, as he mentions here, I'm finishing my PhD very soon, hopefully this week, actually, or at least submitting. But then there's a period of a couple of months where it will be assessed and possibly I make revisions and so forth as I look for postdocs. So that process will take a few months, and my stipend will be concluded on the day I submit, so I won't be getting paid during that time. I still have savings and other sources of income, of course, but nevertheless, Nathan was nice enough to set this up for me as a way to raise a bit of extra money, and so I just thought I'd mention that to anyone who might want to make a contribution to support my work. I really appreciate that. And thanks again, Nathan, for setting this up. So the link to this is in the video description if anyone is interested to chip in there. But yeah, strictly voluntary for anyone who has the means. All right. Yeah, thanks, Dessel. Hopefully that will be finalized sooner rather than later. So while we're on the topic of grifting, I just saw this just as I was starting the stream, so I thought it would be worthwhile talking about. So this is a video from Capturing Christianity called A Massive and Deeply Personal Update About This Channel. Let me just play it for you on 1.5.
It's an update that's not only changed the channel, but it's also literally changed my life. And it's a change that also comes with risks. So when I announced my conversion to Catholicism over 2 years ago, which it's crazy, it's already been 2 years, I also shared my commitment to focusing on the essentials of the Christian faith. That season has been very valuable, but I need to be honest with you guys. It was also incredibly challenging for me personally. For a long time, I felt stuck.
Understand that.
Like the topics that I was covering, they felt very important and they still are very important to me, but they started to feel repetitive. And over time, that repetition turned into legit burnout. So I found myself actually slipping into a very severe depression that was directly tied to my work. But when I began to start to explore new topics like Christianity versus Islam, even exorcisms, theological discussions within Christianity, and then also cultural issues that intersect with the Christian faith, something really amazing started to happen. So suddenly...
So Cameron here is saying that he was finding his previous content repetitive and that was leading him to feel depressed. I am sorry he was feeling depressed. That's a horrible thing to happen to anyone, but let's focus on the aspect of the content here and focus on specifically what he's talking about in terms of changing up the content. So let me now share. Share. Oh, come on, man. Where is it? Okay, here we go. So let's have a look at what his content is these days. Zoom out a little bit. So this is latest on video. So this is pre-edited content over the last, let's have a look at the last year or so. I don't know what exact period of time he's talking about. So we've got, let's look at the stuff that's less than a year. Okay. So gospel's reliable. That's pretty, standard stuff for apologetics. Something about a banned Christian movie. That's, I guess, pop culture stuff. I don't know what that is. Afterlife skeptic. Yeah, that's pretty standard stuff, I would say. Abiogenesis. That's apologetic stuff. Now we've got exorcism. Atheist caller finally stump. That's a bit clickbaity. UFOs. Possession. Sex and gender. That's like culture war stuff. God be evil. I'd say that's sort of standard apologetic stuff. Standard apologetics. Then we've got exorcism, culture war related stuff, Shroud of Turin, which fringe apologetics, I would call that. More culture war stuff. We've got Musk and Peterson, that's culture war stuff. I'm honestly not even sure about what this one is. World War III, the Bible, whatever. Culture war stuff. Oh, this is when he's trolling atheists. So this video got a lot of negative feedback because of he framed it as a prank, and a lot of people didn't like that. This is apologetic stuff. We've got more Shroud stuff. I don't actually know what this one is. More Shroud stuff, more Shroud stuff. The Shroud stuff does really, really well. So more culture war stuff. Then we've got Islam. He's been doing a whole bunch on that. Shroud stuff, Islam. That's culture war stuff. I'm not sure what that is. Islam, culture war. Anything Trump related, I just call that culture war, or Elon Musk. Because yeah, that's where that fits in. Yeah, that's the whole Philip Goff conversion. I think that's, classic apologetics stuff. So I think that counts. Then we've got Islam and Mormonism, Islam and Mormonism, Islam and Mormonism, Islam and Mormonism. That's apologetic stuff, like theology. So that one's fine. That's culture war stuff. Mormonism, exorcism, culture war, Islam. Yeah, that's sort of Protestant Catholicism stuff. That's kind of theology, I guess. Demon, Islam, God and gender. I think that's probably culture war stuff. That's apologetics, although it's Joe Rogan, so it's... oh, wait. No, maybe that's a different one. That's not the Joe Rogan one I was thinking about. Never mind. Islam. This is really just clickbait, so I don't count that as serious apologetics. I don't know what this is. I'm guessing that's clickbait as well, based on the framing of it. This is theology stuff. This is more clickbait. Don't know what that is. This is culture war stuff, and that's the current video. Let's look at lives now. I think this is usually a little better. Well, maybe not actually. Look at some of the topics. So everything less than a year ago. Okay, so this one is about, I think that's fine tuning and such. So that's actually a decent video. Moral argument, decent enough. Heaven is boring, though. This thumbnail is one of the most horrific AI images I've ever seen. Look at that. It's so gaudy. Oops, sorry. I'm going around. Biblical genocide. I'm surprised you could even get away with that in a thumbnail, to be honest. But yeah, that's a reasonable debate. This one is too. But then we've got exorcisms. That's a real debate. Real debate. Not really sure what this one is. We've got demons. Response video. Not sure what that one is. Biology stuff, exorcism. So I'd say these are overall slightly better, although we're going downhill. So we've got that one's all right. We've got demons and aliens. Frank Shurik is a joke. Fine tuning, that's fine. Demons and aliens again. What's his name? Yeah, J. Warner Wallace. Demons, Shroud again. Poke and Dawkins, which really just feels like 12 years out of date. More Shroud stuff. Culture war. That's real, like, apologetic stuff. I'm not sure about this one. More culture war stuff. Islam again. That one's decent by the looks of it. Theology, silly. Oh, actually, I should probably do a response to this one. So Catholic miracle claim. Islam. I think that's more like alien stuff. I'm not sure about that one. That one looks fine. I don't really know about the context of that one. And Islam. So we just went through all of his videos from the last year-ish, not apart from shorts. So there are certainly some valid, like, actual apologetics, theology discussions there. Definitely less than half of the content, maybe a third of the content at a rough guess. The rest of it is, I would categorize as like culture war stuff, mostly relating to Trump, some Musk, some Peterson, that kind of trans issues, gender, that kind of area. And then a bunch of aliens, demons, possession style videos. And then some other more fringe apologetics topics, like, for example, the Shroud of Turin. So the point I'm making with that is this appears to be what Cameron is talking about when he's talking about a shift in content. He's talking about a shift towards that stuff. Okay, so having put that in context, let's go back to that video.
What had felt like a chore for Islam, even exorcisms, theological discussions within Christianity, and then also cultural issues that intersect with the Christian faith. So yeah,
that's a fair summary of what he's moving towards: the Islam stuff, culture war stuff, and what was the other one? Oh yeah, demons and exorcisms and such, as well as aliens. So that has been a large pivot of the channel in the last year or so.
Really
and what happened when
amazing
he did that?
Started to happen. So suddenly, what had felt like a chore for years started to become exciting again for me. Branching out into these other areas didn't just like reignite my passion for creating content, which it did. It genuinely helped pull me out of that deep depression that I was experiencing. And I can honestly say that these past
if that's helped him to feel better, I'm glad about that. But I think it's interesting to hear what he says after this.
8 months or so of exploring new topics have been some of the most fulfilling of my entire career. And here's what's actually really incredible about this. You guys seem to feel the same way that I do about this new content. Since broadening the scope of our content, our monthly views have gone up by literally, I had to look up the numbers, 600%. And new subscribers have skyrocketed by 700%. What this tells me is that these topics are meeting a really important need and they're resonating with so many of you guys. But I also know not everyone agrees with this.
Well, there you have it. Like that's why he does it, because that gets more views and more subscribers, right? The interpretation that shows that the content is meeting an important need is, I'm trying to think if how to phrase that. Most generously, that is an optimistic interpretation. More realistic, I think that's just cope, right? What this indicates is that these sort of more outlandish topics, more attention-grabbing topics like aliens and demons and Jordan Peterson and the gender, culture war, Trump issues, hot button related topics, and Islam as well, which taps into a whole other audience in YouTube, and also people who are worried about the whole clash of civilizations, culture war angle of things, like West versus Islam kind of side of things. Taps into all of that as well. So obviously those sort of topics get more engagement on YouTube than traditional apologetics and theological discussions, typically. I don't know that tells you anything about whether that's meeting a need. It simply tells you that gets clicks. And I think it's really dangerous, actually, to just read off of more views and subscribers that therefore an important need is being met, right? Like, by that logic, it would seem that Mr. Beast videos are like meeting the most important, fundamental, ultimate, substantive need on YouTube, which I think is not the case. Mr. Beast videos are generally very formulaic and not really informative or anything, which is fine. Like, video doesn't have to be informative. I think that they're generally quite bland. But I wouldn't say they're meeting an important need, right? Just because they're getting a lot of views. I think that's really a lot of cope. And it's, in my opinion, a bit embarrassing that Cameron just comes out and says that he was upset because his videos weren't getting many views, and then he switched to more sensational, attention-grabbing topics, and then they started getting a lot more views, and now he's feeling better. That's really quite sad, because the purpose of this channel is supposed to be exposing us to the intellectual side of Christian belief. Now, most of what he's doing these days has little to nothing to do with that. I bet you could say it's tangentially related, but I think most of the culture war and demons and alien stuff has really nothing to do with it. And also, even that, like the critiques of Islam is only peripherally related, because attacking Islam doesn't really tell you anything about Christianity, does it? Like, that's not really, just because Islam is indefensible or has arguments against it or whatever, that actually doesn't tell you about anything about Christianity. So that's not really related either. Not unless you're doing a comparative analysis, which I suspect he is not doing and hasn't done in the videos that I've looked at. Anyway, the point is that I just find this further evidence of the fact that this channel has really, really gone downhill. And it's almost comical at this point that he's sort of expressly acknowledging that, like, yes, these videos get more views, and so I'm going to do more of that. He talks about it as expanding his horizons, but the thing is, there's so many interesting topics that you could discuss from a Christian perspective, whether that's theological, philosophical, day-to-day, even political and social issues, like in a thoughtful, nuanced way. And yes, there are some videos where he does that, but the point is that content is being squeezed out in favor of the nonsense, the sensational, the hyper partisan, and then to claim that is somehow validated by the increase in clicks and subscriptions is just quite sad. All right. So anyway, I know that's not what I promised that I'd be talking about. But I did just see that as I was going live. So I thought it's something worthy of discussion. That is one of the larger apologetics channels, Christian apologetics channels on YouTube, although whether it's even still an apologetics channel could be debated, I suppose. But let us move on from that and talk about this video, because this is what I actually wanted to discuss today. So this video from a couple of weeks ago from Sean McDowell it piqued my interest. Of course, anything relating quantum mechanics to Christian apologetics is something that is likely to be of interest to me. Those are two of my big interests. So the blurb here says, a grim anti-human outlook has taken hold of the public imagination, teaching us all to view ourselves as a random product of a cruel and uncaring natural world. This worldview, which allegedly comes from science, is sorely out of date. In this discussion, Dr. Spencer Klavan, a Yale and Oxford graduate, argues that order, meaning, and harmony in the universe, and specifically quantum mechanics, point to the world described by people of faith in the divine. Point to the world described by people of faith. That clause doesn't read quite right to me. But anyway, so this is based on a new book that this guy's written. I haven't read the book, so I'm only going to be commenting on what they discuss in this video. Yeah, so let's see what they have to say.
Religion is fading away. The notion of God is an illusion. Actually, according to our guest today, Spencer Klavan, graduate of both Yale and Oxford, the opposite is the case. In his new book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Dr. Klavan says, quote, science itself is revealing how deeply the words of creation are etched into the cosmos and into the human heart. Well, I've covered the scientific evidence for God on this channel. The approach we're going to take in this discussion is unique and a new one. Spencer, I've had the privilege of interviewing your dad. It's such a treat to meet you and have you on as well. Thanks for joining us.
Don, it's really great to be here, and I appreciate your making space for Klavan 2.0, the updated version.
Well, some people call me McDowell 2.0.
I never understand this, right? So
I can actually relate to that.
So Sean McDowell has a PhD as well, right? He's a doctor. But why does only Spencer have PhD after his name? Just seems kind of irrelevant to me. And anyway.
Comment, interestingly enough. And that's a conversation you and I need to have some other time. But let's dive into your fascinating book. And this is at the end of the book. But you write this. And I want you to just kind of give us the 30,000-foot view approach of what you're doing in the book. And then we'll go back and walk through the details. You said, quote, we have a choice to make. It is a choice between two visions of the world. What are those two visions? And just kind of lay out what you're hoping to accomplish in your book for us.
Absolutely. Well, I would describe these two visions as the dead machine and the living God. These are really the two ways we have laid out before us of looking at the world, of understanding our place in the universe.
Now, I know this does come at the end of the book, so it's possible that we've got some explanation prior to that as to putting in context these two views. But again, I'm responding to the video, not the book. So the statement here, the hypothesis is that he's articulating is going to be that there's sort of two worldviews open to us, which, well, we'll talk about the labeling in a moment, but it seems to come down to something like naturalism versus theism. And he's saying we have a choice between these two worldviews. Now, again, before we get into that discussion, I just want to highlight a point that I make repeatedly on this channel, which is that this idea that there are two worldviews to choose between is complete and utter nonsense, right? And it's so obviously nonsense that I don't know how anyone can say that with a straight face and not hide under the bed in embarrassment, right? Because there are many, many worldviews available to choose from. Of course, how you define that is going to depend on how you classify things. If you get broad enough and just take a proposition and its negation, then maybe you can make it a binary. But in general, that's not really going to be very satisfactory. And in particular, in the context of here, where he's pretty clearly describing one of the views as theism and another sounds something a lot like naturalism, there are absolutely worldviews aside from either of those two. So a very obvious example would be Buddhism, at least as traditionally understood. Buddhism is not a theistic religion. It does not have a creator God in anything like the Christian or Islamic conception, or even really the Hindu conception. Yet also is not, at least traditionally, a mechanistic naturalistic religion in the sense that it does postulate a lot of realms of reality and processes like karma, for example, that operate outside of what we might ordinarily think of in science as the physical natural world. I know there are some Buddhists who interpret things differently, but of course that's true for any religion, right? So that's just one example of a worldview which seems on the face of it to be pretty different from either of these two, theism and naturalism. And of course there are many others as well, right? Panentheism, pantheism, where God is the universe, or God is the universe and beyond the universe. And there's many different conceptions of God, of course, but I guess maybe we can collapse all of those together. There's what's the word I'm looking for? Panpsychist views, which think that, which generally deny God, but then there's this sort of fundamental mentality or intentionality to the consciousness to the universe, which is an interesting view. And a whole bunch of others as well that I probably haven't even thought of off the cuff. So, but the point that I want to make that is simply is that apologists do this to try to make it that an argument against naturalism counts as an argument for theism. But this really isn't the case. Perhaps an argument against naturalism should raise your credence in theism in some capacity, but it's not directly an argument for it because there's simply no binary there. An argument against naturalism is an argument against naturalism, and that's it. It's not an argument for theism because there are many other views possible aside from simply naturalism, right? So less than 2 minutes in, and I'm already frustrated by the framing here, which I just don't see any excuse for. It's just obviously not true that there's only two worldviews that we're presented between.
And of asking the big questions that we all still ask, even though we don't like to get deep these days. Typically conversations tend to stay kind of shallow. But at the end of the day, lying in bed at night, facing down life's big challenges, you still come back to these ultimate questions of who we are, what we're made of, and where we're going. And I think the dead machine version of that viewpoint is the one that has been dominating in the Western mind for several centuries, perhaps 400 years or so. And I grew up with it.
I think it's odd to say that the dead machine view, which he doesn't actually define here, by the way, but I'm assuming he means like mechanistic naturalism, physicalism. It's odd to say that that's dominated the West for 400 years, going back to Galileo, I guess. I think you'd be hard pressed to say it goes back much more than the French Revolution, late Enlightenment. But even in the Enlightenment, most of the prominent thinkers and writers were deists, not atheists. There were a few atheists, like Baron de Holbach, but he was in the minority. And of course, deism, the idea that God created the universe, but then leaves it to run like a clock, so it operates by clockwork and it kind of just follows its own laws. It's not obvious where that fits into this dichotomy that Spencer's established here, because on the one hand, it's mostly mechanistic, but there is a divine creative force behind it. But as we'll see later, that it does seem inconsistent with some of the aspects of the theistic worldview that Spencer's going to advocate for. So even deism doesn't obviously fit into this dichotomy. But this 400 years timeline, I think, is just not really supportable. Maybe 200 years, you could say, that the kind of naturalistic mechanistic view has dominated. It's hard to pin that down, but 400 really seems a stretch to me. But anyway, that's a minor point.
Surrounded by people who took it for granted that at the end of the day, what we are is a collection of atoms. We are, as Stephen Hawking once said, chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet. And sometimes people are a little bit more cheery.
Okay, but we are chemical. I wouldn't use the word scum. I'm not even sure what that means, right? In a chemical sense. But we are chemicals on a moderate-sized planet, right? Even if you believe, here's the thing, even if you believe in God, who created everything, he still created us as chemical beings on a moderately sized planet. So if you think that there's something wrong or something lacking about that, take that up with God, right? Don't take that up with the naturalist. Like, I don't understand how they can at once, on the one hand, say creation is amazing. God created the universe and said it was good, and he created it for our, our benefit or our glory or to glorify him or whatever exactly is the reason. And then on the other hand, they disparage creation by talking about it as all chemical scum on a planet, medium-sized planet, blah, blah, blah. But that's the universe your God created. Why are you being so rude about it? Like, it's the universe is there regardless of whether God created it. It's not like that the universe disappears. You see what I'm saying? That the universe still exists. The question is whether there's anything beyond the physical universe. So what they should be arguing for is giving us reasons why we should think that there's something beyond the physical universe, not disparaging the physical universe. Because again, according to them, God created that, right? It's a weird strategy, in my opinion, to just disparage what they believe as divinely ordained creation. I just don't get that.
About this viewpoint, if you listen to Neil deGrasse Tyson, there's some kind of mysticism of the atom, that out of these churning flows, billions and billions of years, this raw material, this mindless stuff has collided together to accidentally create us. And when we're over, those atoms will decompose, disintegrate back into nothing, and we will be nothing. So live it up.
Well, hang on. Well, it depends what he means by when we're over. So when you die, your atoms don't disappear into nothing. You know, the atoms decay, and then they will re-enter the ecosystem, the carbon cycle, or the the water cycle, or the nitrogen cycle, and so forth. That we circulate, the nutrients are circulated around Earth systems. It doesn't disappear into nothing. Now, maybe he's talking about the very far future, where at the heat death of the universe, where eventually everything, as far as we know currently, the acceleration of the expansion of the universe will continue until even atoms are torn apart, and then I guess they will, in a sense, disappear into nothing. Although it's still not nothing. Like, the energy will be there. It's just there won't be any matter. That's a very long time in the future, though. But it's just odd. It's just like, this is supposed to be based on science, but we're not really getting science. We're just sort of getting vague metaphors. I know this is 3 minutes in, but we could start stronger with like actual appeals to science instead of saying vaguely like our atoms will disappear into nothing. Well, but they won't, though. Like, what are you talking about? But they won't.
And when we're over, those atoms will decompose, disintegrate back into nothing, and we will be nothing. So
what is he talking about? The atoms will disappear into nothing, disintegrate into nothing. No. Unless he's talking about the heat death of the universe. Maybe that's what he means there, but he's not. He says when we are over. I don't know if he means us as individuals or humanity.
Let the world be the world. The problems with this view as a philosophy are now, I think, really evident everywhere.
Notice he hasn't described or explained what the philosophy is. Based on what he said there, what would you say the philosophy is? He described it as we are only atoms. That's basically all he has said. It's not even clear who we is. I guess humans, probably he's talking about. And remember that he agrees that, well, I don't actually know this for definitively. Maybe he's an idealist, but I'm pretty sure he's going to agree that humans are made of atoms. He's going to say that we are more than atoms, right? So it's not enough to disparage the idea that we're atoms. What you need to say is why we should think that there's more to it than that. And so far, we haven't really got anything. We've got this idea that, well, there's a view that we're only atoms, which he calls the dead machine view. By the way, I've never heard anyone else call it that. It seems like a disparaging view. Is there such a thing as an alive machine? I mean, I guess if there was an alive machine, it would be a biological life form, right? Which is kind of like a machine, but it's biological. So in that sense, we're not dead machines, we're alive machines. But if you're going to interpret it differently, you could just say we're biological machines. Machines, like, I don't know where dead machine comes in. That just seems unnecessarily confusing and a weird way to phrase it. Why don't you give it the term that exists in the literature? Naturalism or physicalism or materialism, any of those would be fine. I should say I haven't watched the whole video. I watched like 15 minutes in and got so annoyed that I had to stop. So maybe some of this will be discussed later. But again, this is his introduction, and he's not explained what the view is that he's going to be refuting or arguing against. He's made some sort of generic disparaging remarks, called it a dead machine view, which doesn't really make sense or refer to anything in the literature. And now he's going to tell us what the problem with this view is, that he hasn't even explained what the view is. It's just that the view is just that we're just atoms. Like, that's all he has said about the view. Very lacking in substance here.
Around us. In my lifetime, the emptiness of thinking about the world this way has become painfully apparent. The tragedy of deaths of despair, the way that people are clearly casting about for higher meaning that the machine view can't provide. I think that's a big part of the crisis that we're all living through. But
so that's a conclusion, right? The idea that people believing that we're only atoms leads to despair and depression and such. That's a substantive position. It's a conclusion that you need to provide evidence or arguments in favor of, right? You can't just assert that and have us all accept it, because I don't actually think that that's true at all, or at least at a population level. There may be individuals who find that, but in aggregate terms, I don't think it's believing that we're all atoms that actually contributes to that. Plenty of people who believe that we're not all atoms, who believe in spirits, souls, deities, whatever, who also feel depression and an emptiness, lack of meaning, and so forth. Christian existentialism is a thing. Like, they kind of invented it, actually. But might want to go back and read The Preacher, read Kierkegaard, and then come back and we can talk about this seriously. But the issue is that there's been no effort to substantiate this claim. And I think that the idea is that we're just trying to appeal to it. They're just trying to appeal to an audience who already accepts this uncritically. And so there's no need to actually defend claims like this, that actually it's a sizable social issue, that people feel depressed and lacking in meaning specifically because they believe that we are only atoms. Because that's the only view that he's expounded, right? And I don't think that there's any basis for that at all. Yes, and this is a good point. People have been saying this for decades, that this generation has no meaning. I'm pretty sure it goes back to at least the 60s, because they were saying that about the like hippie movement, right? But honestly, it probably goes back to ancient Greece.
Other view is one which has been in many ways forbidden to us, and that is the view of the living God, that this was not an accident. It's not a collection of mindless parts. It's a rationally ordered form, a creation spoken into being by a mind that loves utterly and knows all. This is...
Okay, so that's clearly theism, the way he described that, traditional omnitheism. Now, here's a question for Spencer. Who forbids you from believing that? Who forbids you from believing in theism? I don't know what country he lives in, but I'm guessing it's not... Well, actually, I can't think of any country that forbids you from believing in theism. I was going to say Saudi Arabia, but that depends on the type of theism. There are countries where you can be persecuted for certain types of religious beliefs, but I don't actually know any country who persecutes people just for believing in God. Even communist China doesn't do that. You cannot practice religions in any public context, right? Like set up churches or proselytize or anything, unless you're one of the like 5 state-sponsored churches. But even in communist China, you're allowed to believe in God, right? They don't actually persecute you for that. So correct me if I'm wrong, chat, but I don't know of any country in the world where today you will actually be persecuted or like forbidden from believing in a creator. And certainly not in the US or Canada or wherever he's from, like in a first world country. So this is just ridiculous. There's absolutely no substance to this idea it's been forbidden. At most, you might say it could be socially awkward in certain contexts because in certain professions, like academia or certain disciplines in academia, like sociology, I know, for example, I've seen data on this, that, yeah, most people are atheists, right? And so if you're a prominent theist there may be certain professional difficulties associated with that, maybe, although it is illegal to discriminate. So I don't, like that's the best you can argue, right? That's the strongest case you can make, and that's very far from it being forbidden. So again, this is just nonsense, right? He's saying that it's kind of been forbidden to believe in theism without any substance to that, which is actually a pretty bold claim, I think. Like, it's not a small thing to make, to state. So I would like some examples, some evidence, some basis for that claim that it's forbidden, or kind of forbidden, or sort of forbidden, however exactly you phrase it, to be a theist in the contemporary world. I just think that's utter hot air.
It's a very scary thing for a lot of people to believe and think about, not only because of the consequences it might have for our ethics and our morality. What does God want from us? Should we maybe think twice before just doing anything we want? But also because...
Who doesn't think twice before just doing anything they want? Like, what? Again, here's another challenge. What worldview actually says just do whatever you want? Even things like hedonism don't actually say that. Moral relativism doesn't say that. Heck, even fascists don't say that. Like, who says this? Yeah, okay, maybe there's some sort of first-year philosophy nihilist poser or whatever at the pub who articulates views like this, but no real like philosophers developing a philosophical worldview or defending it actually just say, oh, just do whatever you want and don't think about it. Like, nobody says that. I don't think anyone has ever said that throughout history. Like, again, no serious thinker. Even views that may be associated with that, like hedonism, don't actually say that. So what are we talking about? What is the substance behind this?
Of the scorn that's been heaped on the traditional religious theist Christian outlook. This is supposed to be a backward superstition that has constrained human knowledge, and anybody who believes in God has to give up.
It has, though, right? And it is
his rational mind. And that too is a narrative that I grew up with. And as I came to faith and as I grew older, it became clear to me that one of the most urgent things in our time is to clear that obstacle away. And so this book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, is an attempt to do a hard reset on that very idea, that barrier between looking at the world, between us and thinking of the world as a created entity and ourselves as created souls, to tell the story of human knowledge, and especially the story of...
Yeah, this is actually what some people in the US think. They think that like not being able to mandate Bible reading or prayers or something in public schools is somehow theists being persecuted. And again, I'm not saying that Spencer thinks that, but that's kind of the best examples people can come up with of persecution of Christians, which is just like not at all. So I don't know what he's talking about.
Science as taking place within the context of a true faith that arose out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Science was a product of Christendom in many ways. And now, importantly, as you said, this is the key, science is actually leading us away from the dead machine view of the world. We haven't really grappled with this as laymen, but science no longer describes the world as a collection of mindless parts. And if we really want to...
Well, it does, though, so that's just wrong. We'll get into that, but it does describe the world as a collection of mindless parts. There is no scientific discipline that appeals to fundamental minded entities. So obviously psychology, cognitive science appeals to minds, right? But those scientific disciplines don't treat minds as fundamental. Treats them as composed of parts that are instantiated in biological systems or in mechanical systems or like computational systems. So there is no scientific discipline. The only people who talk about minds as fundamental, panpsychists or theists or other forms like that, they're doing so in a philosophical context or in very fringe views. Like no scientific discipline talks about minds as being fundamental. So again, he's just talking hot air. Like nothing he has said so far has been substantiated with anything.
"Quote unquote, follow the science." We actually ought to be moving back toward the living God.
We're going to get to your case about why we should do that and where you think the science points. But the way you frame this is exactly right. It's a story. And your book, it hit me. It's not analytical philosophy. It's not just historical apologetics as much as there's value in
So sounds like it's not actually a philosophy book.
that. You're telling a story kind of about the world, this grandiose story, to the moment we find ourselves in today. So to understand our moment, we've got to go back a little bit and retrace some of the things that happened that explain how we got here. Now, as I understand it, there's kind of 3 or 4 main pieces of this story that you tell, although we're generalizing, I think it's accurate. You describe kind of this pre-Socratic view before Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, where some of the first philosophers try to find the unifying principle in the world. Maybe it's fire, maybe it's air, maybe it's water. Aristotle points out what they had in common is they all thought it was material. This shifts with Aristotle. And then you could say maybe it comes to climax over a millennium later plus with Aquinas. So sum up that millennium plus of what Aristotle introduced and kind of climaxed with Aquinas about how they saw the world and why they saw the world the way they did.
Absolutely. Well, as you say, Aristotle is the one who really puts his finger on this. He's doing a review of all the philosophers that have gone before him and what they thought the world was made of. And this is one of the first questions that occurs when people start thinking about stuff is what's out there and where does it come from? And so you have a range of philosophers that are what's called monists. And that word just means that they think everything comes out of one thing. And some of them think it comes from water, that everything is generated.
How come we can introduce the term monism, but we can't say naturalism or materialism? Maybe it'll come later, but in 15 minutes that I listened to, we didn't hear it. Instead, he uses this ridiculous term, the dead machine view. Why?
Out of this kind of oceanic depth of chaos. Some people think that fire is the element that drives all things. Some people think it's air. Some people think it's something a little bit more mysterious, but all of them think it is what Aristotle calls hule, which is just a Greek word meaning stuff, just something you can touch. The pretty natural assumption, if you think about our most immediate experiences of the world, they're sensory, they're tactile. We look at things and we touch things, and that's how we know them and encounter the world. But Aristotle raises this.
So I have no idea how accurate this is in terms of a summary of ancient Greek philosophy. It's not my area of expertise. I would say, though, that most societies have a belief in some form of nature, or they engage in some sort of nature worship or belief in nature spirits. And there seems to be a lot of evidence that the way people naively, sort of intuitively think about things is to attribute agency to the natural world. Not just to animals, but plants, but also like rocks, rivers, the weather, and everything really that exists, like the stars and planets as well, of course. That appears to be very intuitive for humans, and we see that across the vast majority, if not all, cultures have like attribute nature spirits of some form to different components of nature. And what tends to happen over time is that these are gradually systematized and consolidated into sort of fewer forms. Not every religious tradition obviously goes the route of monotheism, but for example, in Hinduism, where there are a variety of gods, those came to be understood as incarnations of ultimately of Brahman, like the underlying god. And likewise in Buddhism, like there's many bodhisattvas and individual Buddhas, but they are all sort of linked to the idea of losing one's self and achieving enlightenment becoming one kind of with the universe, so to speak. So the point is that there's a tendency to systematize and organize these and see them as part of a unifying framework. I think the ancient Greeks the ancient Greeks, and also there's certain threads in ancient Indian philosophy which are very expressly materialistic, but generally they're in the minority from what I've been able to tell. That most philosophies have non-materialist elements, like most pre-modern philosophies, and certainly most pre-modern, like non-literate or at least like non-philosophically producing peoples who don't produce like philosophical writings think about things in terms of nature worship, nature spirits, rather than in terms of the physical. So I think from an anthropological perspective, he's just wrong here. I don't know as much about that, but if his fundamental claim is that the way that people typically think about the world, like pre-theoretically, is in terms of material stuff, I think that that's wrong. Obviously, people do think about the world in terms of material stuff, but they tend to attribute agency behind things. And that appears to be more intuitive and natural for people rather than to go down a thoroughgoing materialist route. That is relatively rare philosophically and anthropologically before the modern world.
World-changing question, and he of course gets it from Plato and Socrates in part, but he's the one that really puts it in the clearest possible terms, which is stuff is just stuff. It doesn't do anything. By its nature, it's inert. So what makes it move? We actually don't encounter a world just made of raw material. We encounter a world in motion, a dynamic world with potential and action. And when I look at something like fire, I'm not just seeing something like clay sitting there in a lump. I'm actually seeing a pattern of movement.
I don't know how you quantify what the most persecuted religion is. Is it just the number of adherents who experience persecution? Because it seems to me that there's a lot of persecution of Muslims in India, and there are a lot of those. But then any religious adherent in China, you could argue they're persecuted because they have a lot of restrictions on what they can do. I think it's probably a meaningless thing to talk about, is which religion is most persecuted. But anyway. The specific claim that I was responding to was the idea that you're not allowed to believe in God. He wasn't actually talking about Christianity. He said that we're forbidden from believing, or we're kind of forbidden or sort of forbidden from being theists. And I don't think there's anywhere in the world where that's actually true.
A tendency in the world. And I think this is really the beginning of the thought that will lead, among other things, to the scientific revolution. Because if there's something in matter that is not itself material, that has a tendency, a pattern, even a nature and a motion, then the human mind can begin to understand and try to figure out what the rules are of this motion. But the key is you have to introduce into your world a whole universe of concepts that don't boil down just to raw material. Aristotle talks about potential and actuality. He talks about form and function, right? These things that we also experience in the world. And he opens our eyes to the fact that even our sensory experiences, even the raw walking through the material world, that's not a materialist experience. We have this rational mind that seems able to calculate things like numbers, which don't have any time or place, but apply throughout the universe. Billions and billions of light years away, the number 2 still does what it does here on Earth. And so,
what does the number 2 do on Earth, Spencer? Could you explain what the number 2 does on Earth? Because it seems to me the number 2 doesn't do anything. It's an abstract concept. Now, you might think it's an abstract object if you're a Platonist, right? I'm not sure his view on that. But either way, it's not normally taken to do anything. Abstract objects don't have causal powers, or at least that's the way they're normally understood. Now, he might just say, oh, well, he's speaking loosely here. But that's kind of important, right? Because if the idea is that you can't account for what numbers do under naturalism, then it's a bit meaningless, because they don't really do anything under most worldviews. That's just not what a number is. It's not the sort of thing that does something if that's understood as having like a causal effect on something. Again, it's just, what's he talking about? What's the problem supposed to be?
So this mystery, which connects the human mind to something eternal, this is the thread that the Christians pick up. Of course, Christianity, as we well know, very complicated relationship to pagan philosophy and to pre-Christian thinking. But it's Aquinas, as you say, who really baptizes Aristotle and says, there's a reason why our brains have this function. There's a reason why we can tap into eternal truths in the world. And that's because we are made in the image of God. Brilliantly connects the Aristotelian scientific worldview with the Genesis account of the Imago Dei, that it's not just an accident that we happen to be able to calculate and chart the movements of the stars. Those stars were mapped out by a mind that then made our minds in a kind of miniature imitation of him. And that's why we can expect to understand the universe, because
this is a completely vacuous explanation, right? So the idea that man is made in the image of God, and that explains how we can understand the order in the universe, doesn't tell us anything at all, because obviously there are many differences between God's mind and our minds. In fact, this is something I want to talk about more in coming videos. But because there are so many differences, you can always point to, well, if we're made in the image of God, why is it that we have such limited working memories? God doesn't presumably have a working memory, right? He just, everything is apparent to him. He doesn't actually need to learn like we do. He doesn't have sensory experiences, again, presumably because he just sort of knows everything directly. He doesn't have to reason, does he? Like, he doesn't have to work things out. He doesn't have to step through the process, again, because he already knows everything. So, like, what would he be working out? He can't work out something he doesn't already know. So he doesn't have to engage in problem solving or decision making. He just sort of knows and decides. So, in fact, it seems to me there's almost nothing in common between a divine mind and a human mind, other than maybe decision making, like the volition, you might call it. But anyway, the point is that, so you might say, oh, well, just like God creates things that are orderly, we can understand order. Well, yeah, but there's a lot of order that we can't understand, that goes beyond us. And there's a lot of things that we think about very differently to how God would, and that aren't intuitive for us or are hard for us to understand, or limitations that we have on our minds. And so why are there all these differences if we're made in the image of God? So in other words, we're created in the image of God, and therefore we have like miniature versions of God's mind, explains nothing, because it appeals to all of the things that we allegedly have in common with the divine mind and its manifestation in the like its creation in the universe, but it then just completely ignores all the things that are different. And there's no account given as to why some things are the same and some things are different. It's just, well, whatever is similar, that is explained by God creating us, and then everything else, well, just don't think about that. It's a completely vacuous explanation that actually doesn't explain anything.
It's made by a God who wants to be known. And so this is where you get really the birth of the university and the medieval academy. And that's kind of the state of play before the scientific revolution shakes things up.
Excellent summary. That is so helpful to see as we move into the time of Aquinas. You have what some call an enchanted world. Everything was not material. Angels and demons are real. Miracles happen. God exists. We have.
So I think that those four examples are important, because we haven't got a definition of the material at this point. It is a little hard to define the material, but there are things you can say. But it seems that it's pretty clear that we're thinking about angels, demons, God, and miracles as all being phenomena that are outside the natural world or the material world. And I would agree with that. As normally conceptualized, those things transcend the natural order. So bear that in mind. So the difference between these views seems to come down to whether you think that there are things such as angels, demons, gods, and miracles, maybe some other things as well, but at least those things.
A soul, we're not just matter. This is a supernatural realm. Although it took a while for this kind of be unseated in Western culture, you trace some of the key beginnings at the time of Laplace and scholars in the 18th century. So now that obviously goes up to today, but what kind of shifted? And maybe who would you say are maybe two or three of just the pivotal figures that really shaped why the world, why our understanding of the world shifted?
Okay, this is my favorite part of the story, because at the end of it, we get to blame the French. And that's always... But yeah, I think you use this concept of enchantment, and it's such a powerful idea and such a revealing way of thinking about things, that we live in a disenchanted world, as I believe it's Charles Taylor who has said, that we move through a world where we take it for granted that we're the most advanced living consciousnesses around, and everything else that moves and acts isn't choosing to move, isn't thinking about things. There's not other entities out there in some supernatural realm. Aquinas, of course, lived in an enchanted world, but the key to understanding...
Yeah, the use of the word enchanted is interesting. I would call it superstition, but, to each his own.
That is to know that Aquinas didn't live in a different world than we live in. He didn't have different physical experiences. He wasn't describing a world that operated according to different laws. He simply discerned in that world powers and motions that are disembodied, that don't have any particular location the way we do in time and space, but still have natures. If you think about the planet Jupiter, it moves in a certain way. You can predict the way it's going to move, and it may be that there is a power appointed by God that makes it move across the sky.
You mean gravity? Is that the power appointed by God? Now, here's an interesting question, Spencer. So I'll give you two options. What allows us to predict the location of Jupiter? Was it A, theologians and people appealing to notions of like divine ordination, agency, and ordering of the universe? Or B, scientists using mechanistic models of matter in motion and calculating trajectories and such? And developing theories based on experiments and theory and so forth. Was it the theologians or the scientists? Which of those allows us to calculate the trajectory of Jupiter? I'll let you think about that at home, and maybe I'll reveal the answer later.
What happens at the end of the medieval period is that people start to poke holes in some of the logic that drives this enchanted universe. And it's very particular at first. It's guys eggheads like me that love archival commentaries, rooting around in Aristotle and thinking like, well, if there's a spirit in nature that moves things, how do arrows move and why do they fall to the ground? Why don't they just keep going, right? And they start to revise the Aristotelian universe. And this is how, for instance, you first get the concept that will become momentum. This is the first time when some of this stuff we all learned about in physics class in high school, this is getting worked out, things like momentum and force, right? And it's all a way of trying to correct the Aristotelian picture of the world. But in the process, as we understand these things more and more, we learn that they're actually much more regular than we previously thought, that there are rules that can even be described with mathematics. And not necessarily, but perhaps inevitably, that thought starts to lead to the thought that, well, maybe these aren't beings out there. Maybe this isn't some disembodied force. Maybe this is just a mathematical property of the world. And you start to get the idea that if you don't think about magical powers and entities, you can chart things really well. You can predict things and understand them. And this is what's called the disenchantment of the universe, where the angels are chased out of the world. But one of the things I point out in my book is that's kind of a misnomer, because we do stop talking about angels eventually, but we don't stop talking
Well, some of us do.
about disembodied forces. We still talk about force, momentum, energy, right? And we think that those are material terms. This is one of the key mistakes that happens here, is we think those are material terms. They're just as immaterial as angels. I mean, this is things, if you take a picture of a ball flying through the air, you can't point to me where the momentum is. That's not an object the way the ball is.
So it's this comment here that led me to stop watching the video, because I feel like the guy's actually just crazy. Like, what are you talking about when you say that momentum is not a material property? Let's go back again and dissect what he's saying here.
Of the universe, where the angels are chased out of the world. But one of the things I point out in my book is that's kind of a misnomer, because we do stop talking about angels eventually, but we don't stop talking about disembodied forces. We still talk about force, momentum, energy, right? And we think that those are...
So momentum and energy, he gives as examples of disembodied forces. They're not really forces, but let's just say disembodied properties, perhaps. So what does he mean by disembodied? Let's see if he explains that.
Material terms. This is one of the key mistakes that happens here, is we think those are material terms. They're just as immaterial as angels. I mean, this is things that...
So energy and momentum are not material, they're immaterial because they're disembodied. And what does that mean? It means...
You take a picture of a ball flying through the air, you can't point to me where the momentum is. That's not an object the way the ball is.
It's because the momentum isn't an object. Okay, so let's go through some very basic terms here. So an object is not really a very precisely defined term scientifically, but we might think of an object as a collection of matter, for example. It might be a particle, but probably wouldn't call that an object. So let's say it's a macroscopic collection of matter, right? So that object will have certain physical properties, which are measurable using experiments, or sometimes deducible from a series of experiments. You can't always measure it directly. So some of the physical properties of an object like a ball would include position. You can localize its position, in space relative to other objects. You can also localize its position in time, so it has a space-time location. It also has a property of momentum, which relates to its mass and velocity, right? It also has a property of, say, electric charge. It's probably neutral if it's macroscopic, but you could measure that as well. And it also has a property of energy. So it will have a certain kinetic energy, which depends on its velocity and mass. And it will have a certain potential energy, probably gravitational potential energy based on its position relative to massive gravitational objects. Okay, so these are all properties of that physical object. All physical objects have these properties. Some differ a bit depending on the size, whether we're talking about very small individual particles or very large objects, but all physical objects have properties like charge, mass, energy, momentum. There's other things like color what was I thinking of? Color and I've forgotten other properties that are relevant to quantum mechanics. But there's nothing non-physical about these things. So he seems to. So Spencer here seems to think that something is physical only if it is a physical object, but it's not really clear why he thinks that. That's strange to me. So maybe he thinks that all properties have to be non-physical. Like if a property is the idea that it's sort of instantiable in different objects, like two different objects could have the same mass, so they have the property of the same mass in common, right? It adheres in different objects. So perhaps he's referring to this idea, and therefore he thinks you can't account for properties in a material universe, or you can do is like count lumps of matter or something, and any properties that matter has must be immaterial. I would say that's an odd view, and he would probably want to give a defense of that, because the way that any sane person, I would say, understands this is simply that there are certain properties that physical objects have in virtue of, the type of physical object that they are. Now, and then there are certain non-physical properties, or maybe certain non-physical properties, that immaterial objects might have. Or, for example, if you believe in dualism, you'll think that there's a distinction between physical and mental properties, and that there's fundamental consciousness or fundamental intentionality or something that exists in the world. God might be an example of that, right? He's not made of anything physical, but he still has properties. So there are some interesting metaphysical issues to be discussed here, but because he hasn't gone anywhere near those, he's just told us that somehow momentum is not a physical object, therefore physicalism is false. So the only way to make sense of that is to define physicalism as a view that only physical objects exist, and they don't have any properties other than, I guess, where they're located. Because he says that you can't say where the momentum is located, which, by the way, is also wrong, because you can say where the momentum is located. It's located at where the object is located. There is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, but let's not get into that, because he said ball, which is a macroscopic object, so that's not really going to be relevant there. Anyway, the point is, the only version of physicalism that has any relevance to this is one that's so wacky and out of date that I have no idea who even holds to this, or really whether anyone even holds to this, because this isn't even like Newtonian. This is pre-Newtonian, right? Like the idea that somehow you can't, like, momentum isn't a physical object, therefore it must be non-physical. Well, no, it's just not an object. It's a property that physical objects have. Like, just it seems to be a fundamental metaphysical confusion here. And yes, there are different views about the nature of properties. You could be a trope theorist, for example, but he hasn't introduced any of that and motivated any of the discussion here. He's just presenting it as a conclusion, as an obvious inference that, well, momentum isn't a physical object, therefore physicalism is wrong. That's just crazy. Like, that's just absolutely nuts as a thing to say.
That's a disembodied, abstract concept to describe its property.
No, momentum is not abstract. You might say that the property of momentum is abstract, but the momentum of a specific object is not abstract. This is the difference between a property and its instantiation. So we can talk about the nature of properties. Maybe that's what he's getting at here, but it's not obvious that he is. But I don't know why the existence of properties itself is an argument against physicalism. Because, again, any physicalist that I know, again, even going back to Newton, thinks that there are physical properties. Maybe you're a trope theorist, and so you don't think there's properties as such. You think that they're tropes or some other view, but some variant of that, right? If you don't know what trope theory is, don't worry about it. I'm just gesturing that there are other understandings. But again, I think I'm doing more work here than is necessary, because he's not talking about any of those things. He's just wanting to foist this really weird view on physicalists that they can only believe in physical stuff in a specific location and nothing else. And yeah, that is a crazy view, but who thinks that? Like, nobody thinks that. So why are we arguing against
its motion, its potential, and so forth? And so the world of spirits gets translated into the world of what will become modern science.
Huh? The world of spirits. What does momentum have to do with spirits? Do spirits have momentum? Do they have electrical charge? Do they have gravitational potential energy? Do they have color charge? Like, what's he talking about? I don't know if there's some historical connection between the notion of, like, potential or momentum or something. And interesting pause, by the way. I don't know if there's some historical connection between these concepts here that I'm unaware of, because I don't know all of the details of how these concepts originated, but I've never heard of that connection. But look, even if there is, it's irrelevant today, because no one thinks about the momentum of a ball as if it's in any way connected to the existence of spirits or ghosts or, like, souls or God or anything. It's just a physical property that macroscopic objects have. So what are we even talking about here, Spencer?
Along comes, of course, Isaac Newton, among other very famous fellows, Galileo before him, Kepler as well. These are all names we know. And these guys, devout Christians, are looking at kind of the wreckage of the old Aristotelian scheme. And they're thinking...
Yeah, this is a good way to put it. He seems to be saying energy is not atoms, therefore it's magic or non-physical. And to be honest, that is kind of how he's defined physicalism. Remember, he hasn't said that. I'm saying physicalism because that's a term for it, or maybe materialism. Some people distinguish those. I don't really distinguish them. But he's defined it as a view that everything is made up of atoms and nothing else. And by nothing else, he seems to also include properties of atoms. So the only thing that you can appeal to is atoms and where they are located, and that's it. Obviously, that's not going to be sufficient to account for pretty much anything, right? So I don't know who is supposed to hold to this view. I don't even know if anyone historically held to this view, at least not since the ancient Greeks. So it'd be nice, Spencer, if we got to know who you're talking about here. So clearly Newton didn't even think about this. I mean, for a start, Newton was a theist, and actually kind of a crazy Bible code theist, by the way, if you're interested in that. So who holds this view? Who holds this crazy version of physicalism? Maybe that's why he actually doesn't call it that, by the way. He gives it his own neologism term. What was it again? Dead machine view. So he can say anything about it that he likes because he just kind of made it up.
Not, how can I get rid of this straitjacket called religion? How can I escape from the nasty church? But instead, how can I honor God by restoring coherence to my description of his universe? Because surely a God who made the universe will make it in a rational way. And that
doesn't follow, by the way. So a rational God may want to create a non-rational, by the way, I don't know what a non-rational universe would look like, but supposing such a thing is possible, why couldn't a rational God create a non-rational universe? Would that just be like a random or a chaotic universe? He could want to do that. We have artists who create non-rational artworks that don't have any regularity to them, that don't appear to be representational in any way. There's like music that doesn't follow any meter. There's strategies in games that require you to like play randomly so the opponent can't predict you, which in a sense is like it's rational, but in a sense it's non-rational because it's random. I'm just gesturing here because I don't know what he's talking about when he says the universe must be made in a rational way. That presupposes the notion of a non-rational universe, but he doesn't explain what that would look like. But I'm just saying that even if that is a cogent idea, it's just not at all obvious that a rational mind would create a rational universe. They might want to create an irrational universe, a chaotic universe. They might have reasons to do that. You're just presupposing. Again, it's just pure guesswork. It's just drawing the bullseye around where you see the dart. It's like, well, we have a universe that has this order to it. By the way, there's a lot of chaos to the universe as well. A lot of things that aren't very ordered. Maybe we'll come to that. But yeah, there is obviously a certain amount of order. And so we're just going to say, oh, well, that's exactly what we'd expect from God. But would you though? Would you though? What's the basis for that?
Project of the scientific revolution is recovering some stable way of knowing the world at a rational level because it will honor God, because it will cash the check that's written in Genesis. And you get, of course, Newtonian mechanics out of this. You get this amazing new tool for establishing how the world works and how it moves.
Yes, and by the way, so although Newton, of course, was a Christian, he didn't develop Newtonian mechanics by reading the Bible and discussing theology. He developed Newtonian mechanics by doing science, essentially, thinking about things abstractly, mechanistically, and quantitatively. And then, of course, it's been developed further a lot since Newton and tested in many different ways. Obviously, it's not a complete description of reality, right? But it's very useful in many contexts. So, again, the point is, theists want to take credit for things that theists did, but conveniently ignore the fact that in doing them, that nothing about their supernatural view actually, I mean, maybe it motivated Newton. I'm not sure about that. It may have, right? But in terms of the actual activity, right? You don't develop Newtonian mechanics by reading the Bible or by praying. This is what I'm saying. It's or debating theology even. Like, it's actually nothing to do with any of that. It's science, right? I mean, I guess science is kind of, modern conception of science develops around the 17th century. So it's sort of contiguous with philosophy, but I think you know what I'm saying, right? It makes a lot more sense to say that Newton as a scientist developed Newtonian mechanics than it does to say Newton as a theologian or a theist developed science, because it was acting as a scientist or proto-scientist around that time that enabled him to do that, not acting as a theologian or a believer in the supernatural.
It was for predicting things much further out in space than had ever been predicted before. And in the wake of that, as more and more of our world comes to look like it's governed by rational laws, that the generation after Newton starts to wonder whether, if we can explain so much without reference to consciousnesses and angels and thoughts out there, if we can explain so much with just automatic mathematical process, what if we can explain everything that way? This is Pierre-Simon Laplace. This is the French sort of inheritor of Newton, who is famously rumored to have told Napoleon he has no need of God as a hypothesis, right? This is not a necessary thing to describe the world. And of course, what is hilarious about this in retrospect is that's only true if you've already narrowed your field of vision so entirely that you don't need to look at the immaterial entities or consider what is a mathematical equation. Really, it's not an object. It's actually a thought in a mind. And so these things start to fade from view kind of in the...
Yeah, but it's a thought in human minds, right? It doesn't have to be a thought in God's mind.
19th century and after Laplace's generation has passed away, you really do get the rise of atomism and Darwin and all this kind of machine view of the world that we live with now.
Yeah, by the way, harkening back. So this is more the 200 years that I was saying, of 200 years where it's academia has been sort of scientifically, mechanistically based, not 400.
A great summary of how we move from the time of Aquinas and then, of course, the early scientific revolutionaries, Galileo, Kepler, were Christians, like you said. Newton, of course, had some non-Christian ideas about the Trinity, but he was a theist for sure. Yeah. And then the way you frame in your book is that we go from Newton, who believed God was behind this and directing it, to saying, wait a minute, if we have these physical laws, we don't need God anymore. This is a sufficient explanation for reality. And with Darwin and with others, not only is God, but the need for human uniqueness moved out. That's the larger story that you tell. Now,
yeah, and that's it, folks. That you heard it from them.
We're going to get to where you think the science is pointing today. But I want to read a section from your book, and maybe you can kind of just unpack this for us a little bit. Is this materialist view of the world that can be
materialist? Okay, so I think that's maybe he said it before, but that's the first time I caught him saying materialist. Spencer hasn't actually used that term yet. I'm curious as to whether he accepts that characterization, because it raises the question why he didn't just start with that instead of making up this stupid dead machine term.
Fully explained, if we just understand what those principles are, has certain implications. And it gave us a certain promise, really towards the end of, say, the 1800s, moving into the 20th century. So I'm going to ask you what this promise is, but let me just read the section and then you can kind of riff on it. You said this story came up with...
You seem to accept it's characterized as materialism, so I have to assume that's what he's talking about.
And it's still with us today. It goes like this. And this is page 100. Man began among the beasts, but he will not stay there. The creature that once huddled naked under the open air, foraging in the dirt for food, jittering and cringing at every unknown snarl in the grim night, this same pitiable wretch will one day master all of nature. Wielding the awesome power of his new science, he will rest in proud serenity amid the glories of a domesticated world. So what is that promise? And not scientifically, but did it culturally work?
Wait, this is where your point...
But isn't that the Christian promise? Like, I don't understand. Everything he said about that seems to be consistent with what Christianity thinks. Remember, Christianity thinks that humans were wretched after the fall, were thrown out of the garden, right? And we were sort of scrambling around in the mud and ignorant about a lot of things and, lost our understanding of God and whatever else. And we've gradually built up science and civilization and so forth. And then eventually he talked about like domesticating the world or something like that. But isn't that what heaven is supposed to be? The earth is like transformed. I don't know if all Christians think that heaven is like literally earth or it's some other realm or whatever happens to earth. But either way, it's like it's some kind of domesticated, idealized version of us living with God, of course. So he didn't mention that. But I guess the point is that description there was supposed to be a derogatory way of talking about the like humanist, materialist objective, like worldview. But it actually doesn't sound that much different to a Christian worldview. You just didn't mention God, but like the idea that humanity starts off as wretched, gradually builds up, and then we sort of like reach this sort of utopia end state. Isn't that what Christians think? Yes, they think that God is behind that, but if you just didn't, I don't know. I just don't see that description is really distinguishing the views very well. Maybe that's their point. It's like, yeah, you can, but you need to have God in the mixture. I don't know.
About stories becomes so important because up to now we've been indulging in a little bit of shop talk, right? We've been talking about what the actual cutting edge experts in each period believed about the material world.
Well, not any current cutting edge experts in the last 100 years, which would be nice, but anyway.
Which is in itself, I think, fascinating enough. But what's really interesting to me is any physical picture of the world is going to have implications for our spiritual life and,
so
and for
it's
our
physical.
Life. And so regular people like you and me who are not scientists, are going to live with a story about science or about natural philosophy or whatever it is in our period that kind of hovers in the air. This is not something that was invented with the modern era. Back in the days of the early church, the best that could be known about the natural world was understood to convey higher truths about God's sovereignty, his wisdom, and his rationality, and so forth. Nowadays, we live with...
People in the comments are mentioning that as well.
A very different kind of religion, but it is still a story that we have derived from what we think about the world. And so out of that Pierre-Simon Laplace idea that everything is atoms moving in predictable ways, a radically revised story about who we are and where we're going starts to take shape. It has to. This is inevitable, because of course before that people are telling themselves a story, hearing a story that I believe is a true story about our trajectory into eternity. But that way has now been closed off. And the guy who gets this and sees it before anybody else is a thinker for whom I have no great love, and that is Friedrich Nietzsche. He says mankind, mankind used to look for his destiny in the stars. That way is closed off. So now he looks backward. But there, grinning, stands the ape. And he has this sense that we're now kind of closed in, right? Nowhere to look for a transcendent horizon. So we have no choice but to place all of that mythology, all of that religion, all of that belief into the atomistic universe, and to make a faith out of atomism. And I think with Darwin, you really have the last piece of this puzzle, that the world emerged out of atoms churning, and we emerged out of organisms fighting one another for survival. And
so again, the disparaging of physical creation is bizarre from theists who believe that God created the world and saw that it was good, right? And that creation is a profound manifestation of God's orderly mind and love for us. Remember that they literally talk out of both sides of their mouth in the same interview or discussion. On the one hand, they say, wow, look at this ordered universe that God made for us. And on the other hand, say, wow, atoms and organisms fighting and dirt, it's all kind of cruddy, and that's all that there is to it. Like they're using disparaging terminology. And it doesn't make any sense, because is Spencer a creationist? That would be an interesting discussion. I'm going to be generous and assume that Sean and Spencer are not young earth creationists, which means that whether or not they believe that there was a divinity behind it, which presumably they do, but they do believe that evolution occurred, right? So they believe in atoms and they believe in evolution, and yet, and they believe that those things were divinely ordained. And yet he nevertheless still describes them in this way.
Make a faith out of atomism. And I think with Darwin, you really have the last piece of this puzzle, that the world emerged out of atoms churning, and we emerged out of organisms fighting one another for survival.
Yeah, the world emerged out of atoms churning, and the world emerged, and we emerged out of organisms fighting each other for survival. Remember, Spencer, assuming he's not a creationist, believes both of those things, and he believes that it was divinely ordained. So why is he presenting it in a negative way with those words that he used there and previously in the discussion as well? He makes it sound negative, but then at the same time wants to say that, well, isn't it great that God made the universe this way? I don't understand how you can have both of those. You can endorse both of those at the same time. If the way that the universe is amazing, then the naturalist in identifying how amazing the universe is only agreeing with the theist who says, yeah, the universe is amazing. Look at what God made for us. The naturalist is just saying, well, yeah, the universe is amazing. I don't think you need a creator, but I still agree it's amazing. Obviously, I'm being a bit loose here saying it amazing, but whatever aspect you're talking about, whether it's like the fact that we exist, or the fact that we can accomplish things or understand things in the universe, it's like the theists want to say that these things are amazing, but then want to deny them at the same time when the naturalist appeals to them. I think that the stronger view is to say these things are amazing, but they're not enough. You need a God, or you need some sort of supernatural purpose or whatever, which I disagree with. But I think that they're being sloppy here. They don't want the naturalist, the materialist, to be able to appeal to these cool things about reality, right? That we exist, and the epic of evolution, and the fact that we're made of star stuff, and our ability to understand and use science to, expand our capabilities and improve livelihoods. They don't want the naturalist to be able to appeal to and take advantage of all this stuff, because that's kind of how they that's a story that they tell that's sort of appealing. And Spencer's all about stories, apparently, so he wants to deny the naturalist that. But in denying the naturalist that, he's kind of then casting aspersions on his God who created all of that universe. So I don't think this is thought through. If you can't cast aspersions and disparage the physical universe and evolution and the way we came to be, if you want to say, but isn't it great that God made all this? Because if it's kind of cruddy, well, blame God. He's the one who made it.
And that picture, which is in itself a very brutal picture with no inherent love or purpose or meaning in it, has to be invested with all of this drama and energy and delight. And this is where you start to get the form of thought that will produce Carl Sagan, right? We're star stuff. We're made out of the stars. We come from this primordial soup, but we are emerging into this ever more complex computational machine. And
yeah, and that's the story, right? That's the story that the naturalists and the humanists will tell. So you can't say that that's problematic just because the universe is somehow bad, or evolution is bad, or atoms are bad, or whatever, or like that they're dirty, or it's chemical scum. You remember all of these terms that he's used, right? Coming from the dirt, fighting each other. That's not going to work because you believe that God made these things. All you could say potentially is that you need, this is good, this is important, but we need more than that.
day we will dominate the nature that produced us. And I think
I don't think that that's what Carl Sagan said, that we're going to dominate nature. At least he was all about the importance of conservation and things. But anyway,
optimism of 19th century industry was that the more technology we get, the more material comforts we have, the more evolved and enlightened we will become. Ultimately, we will do as Francis Bacon promised, and we will conquer death. And that's where we're going. And
bring it on.
You ask how successful it was. I think it was enormously powerful as a piece of rhetoric, to the extent that
we're still going, right? Like life expectancy is still increasing, not due to anything religion has provided, I might add.
Even now in pop songs, we talk about not the love that courses through our veins, but the serotonin that courses through our veins, right? We are so schooled in this language of kind of materialist philosophy that it is actually bone deep. It affects how we even feel as we move through the world, how we think about ourselves, how we talk about.
I actually kind of agree with him on that point. It kind of annoys me when people talk about adrenaline as a substitute for like stress or arousal, or where they talk about dopamine or serotonin as sort of substitutes for pleasure or reward, because almost all of these appeals are not scientifically accurate. And I feel like they provide a misleadingly reductionistic account of how emotions or arousal or physiological states work. So I kind of agree with him there, but probably for different reasons than he does. Like, you know, if you're feeling happy or rewarded or satiated or whatever, don't talk about dopamine or whatever. Just say that, right? Because dopamine plays very complicated roles in many cognitive phenomenon, and it's really just not the same as those higher order psychological concepts. So I that's a pet peeve of mine, but I do think he has a bit of a point there.
Our what I would call our spiritual experiences. As a cultural technology, as a script for building great cathedrals, for making people feel at home in the world, for sanity and for productivity, I would call it an abject failure. I think we're living through its failure. I mean, yeah, we have all been addicted to this materialist way of thinking.
Wait, we built cathedrals with engineering knowledge. Like, what's he talking about? How has it failed? Let's go back.
Great cathedral, all our spiritual experiences, how we even feel as we move through the world, how we think about ourselves, how we talk about our what I would call our spiritual experiences. As a cultural technology, as a script for building great cathedrals, for making people feel at home in the world, for sanity and for productivity, I would call it an abject failure. I think we're
sanity and productivity, making people feel at home in the world, sanity, productivity. Productivity seems like an economic term. Objectively, let's focus on Western nations, which are, I think, where this sort of materialistic, well, Western and maybe East Asia as well, where this materialistic notion has pursued furthest and the least enchanted, so to speak, arguably. Probably the Nordic countries would be the highest manifestation of that, and maybe Japan as well. But anyway, the point is, all very productive, like economically speaking, or if you look at scientific productivity. So I don't understand what he means by, does he think people were more productive in the Middle Ages? Like, what's he talking about? Maybe he doesn't mean productivity in that sense, but then what sense does he mean it in? Okay, so there's productivity and there's feeling at home in the world. I just have no idea how you measure that or assess that. I can't even comment on that. That's so vague. And the other one was sanity, I think. So maybe psychological well-being. While that has a lot to do with physical well-being, that's improved an awful lot. There does seem to be evidence that young people these days are having more psychological problems perhaps than they did in the past, but it's not obvious that this is an actual increase in incidence or just a higher awareness and more willingness to talk about it. I don't think that people were actually psychologically more healthy, say, in the US in the 1950s than they are now. I think people just didn't talk about it as much, and that there was a greater reliance on coping strategies like alcoholism or just domestic violence and not talking about it and covering things up, pretending everything was fine. Whereas these days, it's still, these things are still stigmatized, but I think there's certainly more willingness to talk about these sorts of issues than there used to be. Mental health didn't even used to be understood as a phenomenon. It used to, well, this is ironic actually, because if you go back like pre-19th century, mental health was understood basically in terms of like demonic spirits, like spirit possession or demonic possession or something like that, or perhaps an imbalance of humors, none of which, like all of which are basically appeals to the supernatural realm, or not scientific at least. It's only with a scientific reductionist understanding of mental illness as resulting from behaviors and cognitions, thought patterns, and so forth that are maladaptive, which are then rooted in like genetic differences and neural networks and neurotransmitters and so on and so forth. And there's obviously a lot we still need to work out about that space, but that's how we make progress in these areas. Again, the question would be, what progress has Christianity or any other religion made in improving treatment of like depression or schizophrenia or other mood disorders or personality disorders and so forth in the last 100 years, 50 years? They haven't done anything. Right? There's just this, not the pastoral care and such things can't be helpful in any way. Obviously, that they can be as just interacting with someone at a personal level and showing care and whatever. But there's no advancements in that. It's the same as it always has been. A big mixed bag. Some good, some bad. Whereas our ability to identify and treat mental illnesses is way more advanced than it was 100 years ago. Still a long way to go. But so this idea that like psychological well-being is somehow like lagging behind, I don't see the evidence for that. If anything, I see that we are making progress. Slow, and still a lot of problems. But he's just pulling things out of his butt. He's just saying things without any evidence or arguments for it. The idea that somehow like science can't build cathedrals or it can't help make us more productive, science in like a humanist philosophy, or it can't help us help psychological well-being. But it seems like it does do all those things. And also it's not clear that supernaturalism does any of those things at all or ever has.
Living through its failure. I mean, yeah, we have all been addicted to this materialist way of thinking.
Medieval peasants felt so at home in the world. The thing is, that may have been true in the sense that they understood their place and felt that made sense of their position in the world. But if that's how we cash out the feeling at home in the world, then I don't actually think that's a good thing, right? Because an oppressed group who are denied education can be made to feel at home in the world in that sense of they just believe and accept that that's where God's ordained them to be. And in some sense, that can be satisfying, right? Like, because you feel that you know what you're supposed to be doing and you're doing that. Whereas if you open up all the opportunities and choices that you have, that can be scary. And this was one of the points that Nietzsche made, is that a lot of people are too scared of that. And so they retreat to like a herd mentality, herd morality, and a herd mentality where you just follow along with what other people say and other people tell you what to do. But he's like, no, you need to embrace the fact that you're an individual and you make choices and you need to pursue your own idea of the good and your pursuits and interests. And people like Sartre also talked about this. So anyway, getting a bit off topic, but the point is, if that's how we're defining like feeling at home in the world, then yeah, maybe people in the modern world do feel less at home in the world, but probably that's a good thing. It's because we're actually allowing people to be educated and to think about things and pursue different opportunities and not just slotting them into a role that they will have to fulfill for the rest of their life, regardless of anything else. And being told that it's divinely ordained, and not just peasants, but mind you, but most classes in society historically, and women as well, and working class people from different backgrounds, different races, like all sorts of different types of oppressions have been justified on the basis of things being divinely ordained.
But its fruits have been ever less cultural energy, ever more despair, ever more uncertainty and fragmentation. And I think this was inevitable. Ultimately,
what's the evidence for ever more despair? What's the evidence for any of these things?
You were going to run out of steam in this way because the material world can't explain itself, doesn't have enough resources for us to chart a path that is ethical and right through the world.
Isn't that your conclusion, though? Spencer, could we get some maybe arguments for this, that the material world doesn't have enough resources to explain itself or to determine how to act morally and things like this? It seems that this is the conclusion, not the arguments for it.
And attempts to do so, whereas they can look very good for a few years, are ultimately doomed to fail. And I think that's where we're at right now.
I first heard about this book of yours through a piece in the New York Times by Ross Douthat, who wrote this book. He wrote a book called Believe. He's Catholic. He also cited this book by Rod Dreher that just came out called Living in Wonder. And then he cited your book as kind of this move towards a spiritual awakening that's taken place. And all of you kind of attributed in some fashion or another to the failed promise of this naturalistic account of materialism, and that the new atheists have run out, and we realize you get rid of God, this comes with certain consequences culturally, emotionally, and we don't flourish well without it.
What's the evidence for any of these claims? This is all just hot air. What's the evidence that, okay, so Western society belief in God is much lower than it was 100 years ago, even 50 years ago. That's a fact, okay? Western societies. Actually, that might not be true in like certain Eastern European countries where belief's gone up a bit since fall of communism. But bracketing that, yes, belief in God generally and also participation in organized religion has gone down. There have been issues with declining participation in organized like civic societies. Religion is one of them, but other things like trade unions would be another example, or like social clubs, Rotary and things like this. I don't know if you have that in the US, but anyway, yeah, so that's an issue, right? We can talk about that. It's not clear that that's driven by people not believing in God anymore. It's probably many other factors. But the point is, belief in God, way down. Has psychological well-being gone way down? Material well-being definitely hasn't. Psychological well-being, I don't think the evidence points there. It's certainly mixed at best. And even if it has gone down, then you would need to establish that it's because of the fact that people don't believe in God anymore, not because of any number of other factors that could be attributed to it. I just don't understand how educated, thoughtful people can just blazingly make this statement that, oh, everything's gone to pot because people don't believe in God anymore. How can you possibly know something like that? It's so absurd that people can just say this without any evidence at all, not even trying to justify. And it would be very difficult to substantiate a claim like that because it's so broad a claim and it's such a difficult issue, like to establish causation between a belief in God and like psychological well-being, controlling for all other factors. I don't know the literature well on that, but I'm not. And the thing is, right, if someone deconverts, it's likely that their psychological well-being will go down at least for a while because they're adjusting to the change and the loss of their existing community. That doesn't mean that that previous community was good for them or that the belief was good for them. It just means that it's difficult for people to deal with loss and change. So, I mean, that's a short term. You'd think in the longer term, hopefully they would improve. Their well-being would improve. Maybe doesn't in all cases, right? People are very different. And by the way, I've also never made the claim that people would be better or even society would be better if we just didn't have religion. I think that society would be better if people were less superstitious and willing to accept supernatural explanations for things. But that's not restricted to religion. And there's also many forms of religion that don't emphasize supernatural explanations strongly. Spencer seems to emphasize it fairly strongly because he keeps talking about this idea of like stories and beyond the natural world and so on. But not all religions do that. Or even if it's there, they kind of don't really emphasize it much. It's more about like the moral exemplar of Jesus and doing good works and things like that, and praying and stuff. So it's not. The point is, I've never said that just getting rid of religion will make things better. Even though I do think there are harmful practices in religion, and likewise, I think it's ridiculous to say that just getting rid of belief in religion has made things worse, or reducing belief in religion without any substantiation at all. I think that you should be embarrassed by just saying that, and as if it's just a fact that can be established without even trying to establish it.
You talk about in the book how there's a sense of like the science has moved in a different direction than was expected. And we're going to come back to your case for that in a minute here. But do you think on a popular level, there's a kind of spiritual awakening as well, where people are kind of intuitively recognizing this project failed and I need something else?
I absolutely do. And I think this has been going on for a long time. And by the way, it's not always a comfortable or even necessarily a good thing. It can get easy to be Pollyanna-ish about this. When
that's fine. I really want to get to the science aspect.
He basically told out by this moment because he and his cohort of new atheists
I don't really care about new atheism.
Tribal, I would say, worship. So there's that side of our so-called spiritual awakening that is very, very dark. But then there's the side of it that Russ Douthat, I think, is tracing in that piece. And I found that so beautiful. I thought it was a really gratifying and lovely approach to all three of the books he talks about. My book talks about.
Can we get to the science, please?
Source of spiritual consolation and insight, and things fearlessly intellectual, honest person that she is. I look at the things I want to protect: liberal democracy, human rights, universal dignity for all persons.
Those are all good things.
And I realize that historically,
came out of the Enlightenment, by the way. Oh, well, here we go.
They're not actually universal. They don't fall out of the sky. They come from a very specific teaching, very specific philosophy, way of looking at the world, and that is.
Yeah, and that is the Enlightenment in the 18th century, which was an opposition to and a rejection of domination of thinking by the church and by also secular authorities, which often invoked divine mandates to restrict political freedoms and protections of different classes. The Enlightenment wasn't an inherently atheistic project, but it was definitely in opposition to traditional religion, and it was in opposition to dogmatic dogmatic thinking appeals to tradition, appeals to authority, and supported thinking about things in terms of human well-being and human ingenuity and in terms of rationality and using the human capabilities, which most of them believe were God-given, but nevertheless human capabilities that we have to think through things logically. It wasn't from reading things off the Bible or, oh, let's pray and work out what God wants us to do as the arbiter of morality. Like, that is not what the Enlightenment was as a project. But I'm worried he's going to kind of say that it was.
Christianity.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, even though most of the leading figures in the Enlightenment either were heterodox Christians, deists, or outright atheists. Not so many outright atheists, but there were a few. The idea that the Enlightenment was somehow a Christian project is the most absolute historical nonsense well, maybe not the most, but it's certainly up there that I've ever heard. It came in a Christian context, yes, because obviously it developed in a society which historically had been Christian. Of course, if we go back further than that, Christianity emerged in a pagan context. So everything has a context, right? Go back further. But no, the Enlightenment wasn't in any sense a Christian project.
Ali is a great person to think about here because she took the crucial next step, which is to say, if these philosophies have produced all of these wonderful ideas that we wish to endorse and affirm, and if you...
Oh, you mean like humanism? Because, the notion of universal human rights is the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, right? That was written by French revolutionaries and was fundamentally a secular document. Whatever.
Don't get those ideas without the first principles of Christianity, then we should consider the possibility that
what are the
Christianity
first principles of Christianity, by the way? And how do they inform the notion of... Look, I need to move past this point because it triggers me so much, but also it's something that I have talked about before and we'll need to cover in more detail, probably with Nathan in a BA, where we go through all this stuff. So going to skip through this whole Enlightenment was Christian and we have to thank Christianity for human rights, because it's not even really the topic of the video.
That don't have to do with quantum physics, or at least don't require
quantum physics.
You summed up those other periods. Sum up what you think has happened in science and maybe why that's so significant.
Gladly. This is, of course, the most exciting dimension of it to me. And I think, as you say, this is what the book has to contribute. Notice
that the topic of the title of the video is Why Science Reveals a God-Ordained Universe. We're half an hour in, and he hasn't really said anything about how science reveals a God-Ordained universe. At most, it's sort of vague references to philosophers and scientists hundreds of years ago, and somehow vaguely referring to the fact that if something is not a physical object, then therefore it's not physical, and you can't be a physicalist if you think that there's such a thing as momentum. Certainly nothing about quantum physics. So it'd be nice to get some of that in the last bit of the video.
I'm such an enormous admirer of Stephen Meyer, and that's why I asked him to write the foreword. I think he has covered an enormous range of scientific discoveries that don't have to do with quantum physics, or at least don't require an understanding of quantum physics to grasp them. And those discoveries, too, point us toward a theistic vision of the universe, a theistic interpretation of the evidence. And so in some ways, like, I'm building a little wing upon the giant castle that Stephen has created. But I think it is important to go back to that Pierre-Simon Laplace moment, this moment of peak atomism, when the kind of post-Newtonian material...
Is that all he's arguing against, atomism? Like, no one's an atomist anymore. Like, what? We haven't been atomists for, I don't even know how long, at least 100 years. I guess since they split the atom, which is, electrons, well, not split the atom, but like electrons were discovered in the 1898, right? Which smaller than an atom. So we're talking 125 years here, at least. And even then, you could probably go back to like Maxwell with electromagnetism, which was about the electromagnetic fields, which is not really an atomistic theory. So I'd probably go back further than that. Why is he arguing against the view that's at least 150 years out of date?
Material mechanical philosophy starts to take hold, because it's in that moment that Laplace writes a very famous essay on probabilities. And the point of that essay is actually that if we had enough information, there would be no probabilities. There would only be certainties, because, he says, there would be a perfect mind that could know the position and momentum of every particle in the universe. And for that mind, past, present, and future would lie open before him as if he were omniscient, because these basic material facts, locational data, and quantitative facts about atoms and particles contains everything you need to know that locks the universe into this rigid set of laws. And from that idea, you can easily get your way to predicting something like Darwinism and something like Freudianism even.
What the hell? The idea of the Laplace's... So the idea that you can compute the past and if you knew the position and momentum of all of the atoms in the universe, and, we ignore quantum mechanics and such, you could predict the future and the past and with perfect fidelity, right? Somehow that gets you to Darwinism and Freudianism? I'm really struggling to take this guy seriously, because that is just such a ridiculously idiotic thing to say. What does Freudianism have to do with atomism? Like, Freudianism is a philosophy that's based on the idea of the ego and the id and the superego and the interactions between them, and the a psychosexual development of how you view your mother and father and different stages of sexual development. Like, what does that have to do with atomism in any way? And what does Darwinism, for that matter, have to do with atomism? Darwinism is only about differential survival of different genes or versions of genes, alleles in a population over time, leading to changes in the frequencies of those alleles in the population, which are determined by the selective pressures of the environment. Again, I don't think anything to do with whether things are made of atoms or something else, or whether they're spirits or no spirits, has any bearing on that, as evidenced by how many theists who believe in the supernatural realm, or dualists or something else, also believe in evolution. how can any serious person defend the claim that atomism leads to Darwinism and Freudianism? I just do not understand this.
Everything is this automatic, mindless process of physical material laws that can be quantified. The reason this is so important to grasp as a moment in history is because Laplace was wrong. He was dead wrong at a physical, scientific level. And that's what the quantum revolution is about.
Yeah, we know, Spencer. We've done like high school physics, and we know about relativity and quantum mechanics. So, okay, like that. I think Spencer just thinks that everyone is an atomist, like all physicalists are atomists, and have somehow forgotten, not heard about the quantum revolution and relativity. And so Spencer actually seems to think that pointing out the existence of quantum mechanics is somehow a knockdown argument against materialism, because he seems to think materialism is just atomism. But even that's not quite right, because remember, he argued that momentum, the existence of momentum, is an argument against atomism as well. And, Newton believed in it. So I don't even know. But what a wacky view, man. What a wacky view. Here's a radical idea. How about you actually, this is more directed to Sean, I guess, get a physicalist on and have them defend how they understand physicalism. Maybe he's done that before. But I won't say that right now. But let's get a physicalist on who actually understands this stuff and who can defend a substantive version of physicalism. And let's not talk about this 200-year out of date idea of what physicalism is.
And it's preceded, and this is a part of the story that not everybody grasps, but Thomas Kuhn wrote about it brilliantly. It's preceded by Ludwig Boltzmann and what's called statistical mechanics, which is a way of figuring out how gases move in a room. It's much more than that. It's about entropy and how particles bounce off one another and diffuse into the world. And the question that scientists are trying to figure out is, well, when you diffuse a gas into a room, right? If you start with a small cloud of gas, it will ultimately expand into the biggest, most diffuse area it can. Why doesn't it ever go back? There's nothing in the laws of physics that makes it impossible for the gas to just cloud back up into that little collection. Why doesn't it ever go back? And the answer Boltzmann comes up with is that each collision of each gas particle in that cloud, if you will allow me to nerd out for just a second here, like each collision is not actually 100% determined, even if you know everything about their motion. You can't say for sure whether it's going to bounce off at like a 45-degree angle or a 46-degree angle, to again simplify things. Instead, what you have is probability. You have more and less likely outcomes of each one of those little collisions. And once you add all those collisions up together, you get a vastly more likely outcome, which is the diffusion of the gas.
So I don't know what Boltzmann himself thought about this, but the idea that classical statistical mechanics is fundamentally stochastic is not correct. It's stochastic because we don't know. It's an epistemic limitation. We don't know about the microstate. We don't know what the exact configuration of particles is. What we can do is measure macroscopic variables like pressure and temperature and things like that. And then statistical mechanics relates statistically the relationship between those macroscopic variables and microscopic states. And that's what entropy is. It basically just describes how many ways there are of instantiating a given macroscopic state. And like all of the gas spread equally throughout a room is much more likely than all of the gas crowded in a corner, because there are many more ways to instantiate that microscopically. It in no way, I don't know what Boltzmann personally thought about this. I suspect that Spencer is wrong about this because he's wrong about pretty much everything else. But irrespective of Boltzmann's particular interpretation or views of it, classical statistical mechanics is not based on a fundamental randomness at the level of the microstates. It's the probability there. The statistics comes in at the level of the fact that we don't know what the microstate is, and we can only measure macroscopic variables, and so there's uncertainty. That's an epistemic limitation. The fundamental uncertainty brought about by quantum mechanics comes much later. That's that's what the big shift is, that it's not just an epistemic limitation. It's actually, well, I mean, there's still debate about the interpretations of this, but at least it seems to be, or many people think, that the quantum uncertainty is fundamental. It's not just about our limitation of knowledge like it is in the classical statistical mechanics. So, and I'm pretty sure, like at the level of interpreting the science, Spencer's wrong here. I don't know about, because he did phrase it in terms of Boltzmann's opinion. Maybe Boltzmann interpreted it in a weird way. I don't know that, but I suspect he's also wrong about that too. Again, just based on induction of him being wrong about almost everything else that he said.
A possibility that entropy is going to
wrong or too vague to interpret.
Go backward and time will run in reverse and the gas will recollect is so vanishingly small that it can that never to happen. Great solution, Boltzmann, to this problem. Also, radically
Boltzmann
undermining the entire premise of Newtonian mechanics. And it's that idea.
How does classical statistical mechanics undermine the premise of Newtonian mechanics? It in no way does. it's built on the idea of Newtonian mechanics of like of collisions between ball-like particles that transfer momentum. What is he talking about? He's just wrong. He just doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah. When it gets carried into the world of light and the question of how light travels and how radiation moves, that idea in its analog at the particulate level translates into quantum physics. And what quantum physics says essentially is what we're looking at when we look at the raw materials of matter might not actually be little chunks of stuff after all. It might be something more like—
Yes, because atomism is wrong. Like everything is not fundamentally made of atoms. Atoms have constituent components. What a shocking view. It's only 100 years ago, this was
like a collection of probabilities, things that might be but are not. You know, when Frodo is meeting the Lady Galadriel and she pours the water into the pool and she says, the mirror sees many things, things that are, things that were, and some things that have not yet come to pass, right?
But isn't that Laplace, like predicting out all of the possible outcomes? I guess in Laplace you only have one. Well, no, but you could have multiple possible outcomes if you just tweak the initial conditions slightly. Whatever.
Quantum physics. Like there are some things that have not yet come to pass, and they are actually indeterminate at the level, at such a profound level, that until those things come to pass, and until we observe, for instance, the motion of subatomic particles through a screen with two slits in it, until we observe that, we actually can't say anything about their definite location. We can only say something about their possibilities, and all those possibilities with their various likelihoods exist in one moment. They're not. It's not as if they are sort of different colors or smudges on a screen. It's that they are all true at the same time until.
Well, that's one interpretation of quantum mechanics, right? The idea that they exist in superposition. There's many interpretations of quantum mechanics. Don't have time to go into that here. But there's no agreement as to the ontological status of a superposition before it's collapsed. Whether all of those states somehow exist on top of each other, or whether the system actually does have a definitive state, but we're not able to observe that. For example, if you believe in the many worlds interpretation, then there's no actual collapse, that all possibilities actually coexist alongside each other, which is, well, I guess it's sort of superposition, but it's not seen as a superposition because there's no collapse afterwards. Anyway, it's hard to say whether what he's saying is correct here because it's rather vague. You need to start talking about which interpretation of quantum mechanics you're referring to. But yeah, so if you believe in a hidden variables interpretation, then there is no superposition. There's the quantum state always has a definite, always exists in one definite state. But if you believe in an objective collapse view, which I tend to favor, then there is a superposition, and then there's an objective collapse at some point after that when the system is perturbed. Or if you believe in many worlds, then there is a superposition, but there's no actual collapse. It's sort of they're separate realities. I'm being very loose here because I want to get to the point, but he really needs to be clear about which interpretation he's talking about, because they do say different things.
Till the future resolves itself into the present. Now, why does this matter at all? Well,
good question, Anzov.
That turns out to imply is that what we're dealing with out there in the world is not just a pre-existing box of stuff with all of these quantifiable properties like location and texture and size and shape and all of that, but rather a field of possibility that takes on the properties of material and position and location and time when it makes contact with us, that we have the power or the property of resolving the world into what we see around us, which is a material world. But that world in itself is—
also, it is a material world. Okay, so we are materialists. So he does agree that quantum fields are material, right? Because there's a debate about lots of things, and this is something I'm quite interested in myself, but I would personally characterize contemporary materialism as the view that quantum fields and their properties constitute everything that exists in reality, or anything that exists does so in virtue of configurations and interactions of quantum fields if you sort of go far enough down in the reductionist scale. We often can't describe things at that level, so we use higher order constructs, molecules, cells, organisms, societies, right? Planets and things. But ultimately, those things are all made up out of, constituted by quantum fields in particular configurations and with certain interactions. That's loosely how I'd characterize contemporary materialism. So he seems to agree with that because he just said that these fields that make up everything are physical or material, perhaps he said. Let me just get that right.
Material and position,
he said the
and
material.
Location and time when it makes contact with us, that we have the power or the property of resolving the world into what we see around us, which is a material world. But that world in itself is not the end of the story. The real story is a marriage or a relationship between the human mind and whatever else is out there outside of us.
Okay, so now he seems to be saying that the collapse of quantum superposition is triggered by the interaction with the human mind. This is well, I have to be careful here. There are some serious people who have advocated for this, but for the most part, I would say that this is pseudoscience and pseudo-philosophy, and there's really no basis for thinking this. It's certainly not established that this is the case. You can believe that if you want, but you have to make a lot of ad hoc assumptions to get this to work. It's certainly not the case that you need to interpret quantum mechanics this way. So the collapse of so just to make sure we're on the same page here. So what he's talking about is the idea that a quantum event, let's say whether a particle, an electron that you've shot using your electron gun through a small slit, a small double slit, has 50% probability of going through one of the slits and 50% probability of going through the other slit, or at least being observed to have passed through one of those slits, right? And the idea is that until an observation is made, we can't say, and in fact, there seems to be no fact of the matter about which slit that the electron passed through. It seems that it passes through both slits until an observation is made, which if you then identify which slit that it passed through, then it collapses the superposition, and the electron is observed to have passed through one of those slits. And you do that multiple times, right? And you can calculate probabilities over many experiments. But what he seems to be saying, Spencer, here is that the collapse of this superposition of like going through both slits to going through only one slit is driven by the interaction of human consciousness. And that is not the standard way, or I would say a sensible way of interpreting the theory and the results of experiments. What collapse is, what a measurement is well, again, there's different interpretations of this, but it's typically thought to be an interaction of a quantum system with a macroscopic system, which results in entanglement, and thereby disrupts the superposition that we observe. I should say that results in entanglement between the quantum system and the macroscopic system, which, due to the massively larger number of degrees of freedom in the macroscopic system, means that the interference between the two outcomes is no longer visible. And what we observe is essentially a classical outcome, which is that the electron went through one slit or it went through the other. So we don't need to get into all the details of that. All we have to understand is that collapse is understood to be a physical process which occurs whenever you disrupt the quantum system in a way that interacts with a larger environment, generally a macroscopic environment, though macroscopic doesn't have to mean particularly large, right? It certainly doesn't in any way necessitate interaction with a human mind or any other type of mind. It's simply some other system, right? Of course, the human mind, if you're a physicalist, is a very large system, so that will certainly do it. But any sufficiently large object that is not, any sufficiently large object will disrupt the interference pattern because it will interact and with the quantum system and disrupt its interference. And disrupt its superposition, causing collapse. Or at least that's generally how it's understood. You can, if you like, hypothesize that it's actually human consciousness that causes the collapse, but there's simply no reason to do that. And it raises a whole host of questions like which human consciousness and how that interaction is mediated, and how spatially, temporally close you have to be, and so on and so forth. Well, let's just keep playing, because maybe he's going to clarify what he's saying, but it's not sounding good.
This makes our consciousness, our awareness of the world,
there we go,
potentially into a fundamental ingredient of reality. It's not just an accidental byproduct of atomic motion. It's actually akin to matter in its essence, its essential nature. That this stuff can't be erased. You can't imagine us away. You can't cancel out humanity. We're actually an essential part of creating reality. And if that's true, then the mind itself is actually an ingredient of reality and potentially indispensable for existence, which is where I ultimately take the book to say, if that's the case, then you actually need a mind there from the beginning. You need a consciousness, or something like our consciousness, to set the universe spinning. And
well, this also doesn't make sense, because if God is the idea that consciousness causes collapse, which does appear to be what he's arguing for here, if God exists, then why does he not immediately collapse every quantum system? Because he's God, right? He observes everything. He presumably is able to collapse quantum states. He must have been collapsing quantum states for reality to keep going prior to humans existing, assuming there was a time when the universe existed but humans didn't. exist. I presume Spencer would agree with that. In which case, I guess God was collapsing all the quantum states. But then when humans arrived, God like stops collapsing at least some of the quantum states and allows humans to collapse them. You see how this view is completely ridiculous, right? Like you can't actually make any sense of it. It's just utter drivel. There's no scientific basis for this at all. It's based on a misunderstanding of what a measurement is and what an observation is. It has nothing to do with consciousness. It's all about interacting quantum systems with macroscopic classical systems. And yes, there are philosophical questions to talk about there. Like some interpretations think that collapse is real and some think that it isn't, but he's not talking about that here. He's pretty clearly advocating for the idea that it's actually human consciousness that causes, but also sometimes God consciousness, but like sometimes not consciousness that causes the collapse of quantum systems. And therefore the physical can't, like the quantum systems somehow can't exist without the mind. There's absolutely no basis for that at all.
Once you're there, you're basically in the book of Genesis.
Now we're gonna come back to some of the specifics of your case, but I want to point out to make sure.
By the way, you can believe in a creator and not believe in the book of Genesis. I don't understand what the connection is between believing in a creator and believing in the book of Genesis. Like Hindus believe in a creator, but they don't believe in the book of Genesis, right? Or at least not most of them. So what, like Spencer, what are you talking about? I feel like that's just been what I've saying throughout this, what I've been saying throughout this whole video. Spencer, what are you talking about? He just pulls ridiculous claims out of his something, doesn't argue for them or substantiate them, and then just puts them out there as if they're just completely obvious. Historical claims, philosophical claims, sociological claims, scientific claims. Almost everything he has said is either too vague to assess or just wrong. It's just, this is one of the worst videos that I have seen in a long time, just because of the sheer volume of nonsense and misleading and confused comments and claims.
Viewers don't miss this. As you argue from the beginning, mind has always been a part of reality, and we never really escaped it. And this is on page.
Well, of course, theists think that, right? Because they think God's always been around. That again, that's a conclusion. That's not an argument.
Page 5 of your book in the introduction, you say, somewhere in our hearts, we are still certain that the world has order. We believe the human mind is not an accident. We expect there to be answers to our scientific questions, and it feels like a promise. And then you make the point that order, meaning, and harmony, these are more than physical things. And you said earlier that numbers are not physical. I'll take my kids and I'll write the number 5. And I'll say, if I erase that, did I destroy the number 5? No. There's a difference between a numeral and the number. Now, what happened with this obvious common sense intuition that we have about order, design, and purpose is that.
By the way, this point about, I have to address this point about numbers, right? Again, of course, there's disputes about the nature of numbers. But yeah, so numbers are not physical in the sense that any representation of a number is not the number itself. But that's true for actually kind of anything that's a property or an abstraction. So let's take the example of, so what the theist might say is that numbers are like an idea in God's mind, and we need that idea in God's mind somehow to like use numbers or whatever. But let's apply that to other things. And the example I like to use is the United States dollar, okay? The currency, the United States dollar. If I have a US dollar and I burn it, indeed, even if I burned all US dollars, the physical form of them, I haven't destroyed the US dollar, right? The US dollar still exists. It's a currency because it's not a physical thing. It can be instantiated with pieces of paper or numbers on a machine, but none of those things are the US dollar, right? Now, and you can pick a different example if you don't like that. The English language, for example, or the US economy, the US government, right? The family, like pick any of these things, right? And they are abstractions that are instantiated in generally multiple ways, but are not identical to those instantiations. So are we to believe that all of these things are just ideas in God's mind, and that's how we interact with them and come to know about them, is by somehow, I don't know, telepathically connecting to God's mind because we're created in an image? Like all languages exist in ideas in God's mind, and that's how we're able to speak languages, currencies, economies. You just take this for anything for which it is true that a specific instantiation is not identical to the thing itself, which is actually most things, right? Oh, sports games would be another example of this. So no match is the same as the game itself. Are those ideas in God's mind? It's just ridiculous, right? This is a non-explanation, because if you actually believe this, that anything that can be like multiply instantiated in this way and transcends any individual instantiation must be an idea in God's mind, then you end up saying that almost everything that exists in human society and economies and ideas that we've come up with, languages that we speak, all of that are ideas in God's mind, and probably a bunch more other things as well. Oh, the weather. There's another example, like the weather. The weather's not something you can point to or one thing that exists. It just describes the totality of interactions across the atmosphere. So does the weather, is that an idea in God's mind? Like almost everything just becomes an idea in God's mind. So maybe if you want to go like IP route of Christian idealism, then perhaps you're comfortable with that. But if you believe the physical world exists, not just as an idea in God's mind, then I think you're going to acknowledge that there are things that can be multiply instantiated that are not themselves ideas in God's mind. Of course, God would know about them, but they exist beyond God's mind. And numbers then could be something like that, right? So this is not a serious argument against physicalism. There's more to be said about the nature of numbers. I'm not saying I've exhaustively explored that area. It's one of the things I'm discussing in my book, for example, but you just haven't thought through it if you haven't considered these other examples as well, because they just obviously, obviously this argument would apply to all of these other things as well. And then you've got God's head just, all of this stuff just cluttering around God's head that really doesn't seem like a good explanation of these sorts of things. Yeah, Dogecoin, there's another example, like any of these things. Anyway, let's keep going.
We were kind of talked out of it by the scientific revolution. Now, you do raise a few questions in your book. For example, if we could just observe everything and reduce it down to objects, well, who's doing the observing? Because that's not a physical process itself. So in many ways, it seems...
In quantum mechanics, observation is understood as a physical process. It's an interaction between physical systems.
To me, there's kind of a paradox that quantum mechanics is so incredibly counterintuitive. And yet, on the other hand, it actually is intuitive because it implies there's a kind of mind involved in the universe itself. Do you agree with that breakdown? Tell me your thoughts on that and then kind of bring it.
I've already said it does not imply any such mind. Also, if God made us in his image and the image God had of the universe was fundamentally a quantum mechanical one, why is quantum mechanics so hard to understand and so counterintuitive and often so hard to use to predict anything, actually? I don't know that that's what you'd expect a ordered and orderly and benevolent creator to come up with as the fundamental... like most calculations in quantum field theory we can't even do because the mechanisms that we, like the formalism that we have, it just blows up to infinities, and we have to come up with excruciatingly roundabout ways of doing the calculations for the most simple basic systems. In many cases we can't do the calculations even in the full form. That's the version of reality that God wanted. I mean, I guess he could come up with anything, right? But it's just a joke. Like, there's no constraints on what God could or would want to do. When it's orderly, they appeal to that. And when it's not, or when it's too complicated, or when it's chaotic or random or unpredictable, then they just don't talk about it. It's so ridiculous.
Full circle, why you think quantum physics points towards God.
Yeah, I love that way of putting it. I mean, there's a commonplace saying that if you think you understand quantum physics, you don't understand it.
Yes, well, that's more true of some than others, let's say.
And I get why people say that, because so many of the concepts in quantum physics are paradoxical from a purely materialist point of view of the universe, right? If you think that everything is just objects, then it's meaningless to speak of something being in two locations at once or taking two paths until observed and collapsing into one, right? But not so, not paradoxical, in fact, if you think that there's more to the world than just objects. And even the way we talk about...
Okay, so a wave is not localized to a single location. So this was understood back in Maxwell, right? So we're talking... Honestly, we're getting closer to 200 than 150 years ago, 1850s, I think. So, Maxwell understood that this idea that light is because Newton believed in the corpuscular theory of light, that it was a particle. Maxwell's equations introduced the idea that no, light is as a wave, and what a wave is not localized at a specific location. Like, it has a wavelength, so it exists in space, but you can't say exactly where it is located. It's sort of spread out over space. That's not exactly the same as the idea of quantum superposition, because that can involve entanglement between two very physically separated objects. But the point is, this idea that not everything is an object that has a precise location is very old and predates quantum mechanics. And I don't know what Spencer is talking about when he says that somehow that undermines materialism. I swear Spencer just thinks materialism is atomism without even momentum, because that was problematic as well. And just no one, I think, has ever thought, no one in the history of mankind has entertained the physicalist philosophy, I think, that Spencer is attributing to the modern world writ large. Like, as far as I can put it together, because it's not even just Newtonianism, because, again, remember, momentum was a problem somehow there as well. And remember also that he thinks that Darwinism and Freudianism are sort of natural entailments or consequences of this materialist view. Now, I don't know how you get that out of atomism, but apparently Spencer did, so his version of it includes those as entailments or consequences. So yeah, I'm gonna wager that not a single human being in the history of mankind has believed in the version of materialism that Spencer is talking about here, because it's an absolute dog's breakfast. So yeah, I mean, if that's the if that's the only other option, I guess you wouldn't choose that, right? Lucky we don't have to believe that as materialists. Lucky no one's actually defended that
challenges
view.
of quantum physics is already kind of gives the game away as it reveals us as materialists, because the entities of quantum physics defy materialist.
Notice that he's just flat out talking about materialism now. So he's not even using his bizarre term. What was it again? It was dead machine, right? So couldn't we just start with materialism, Spencer? Like, I don't know that that's actually accurate, because your version of materialism is really weird, but it's probably better than dead machine, which just doesn't even mean anything. Couldn't we just start with that?
Assumptions. They defy what we think of as matter. And what I would,
well, yeah, because a lot of people have these pre-theoretic notions of what matter is, which is not in fact how matter is. Like, we've found that matter is different to how people thought about it 200 years ago. Matter is like matter is quantum fields in a state of flux and superposition and interaction with each other. That's what matter is. Matter and energy. And, you know, they're sort of two sides of the same coin, because you can interconvert between them. Yeah, pick up a physics book maybe, and you'll learn about this sometime if you're a bit confused. But no one actually thinks that matter is just atoms sort of hitting each other. You can model it that way sometimes, and it's useful enough, but that's not what it is, you know.
say is not so much that you can't understand quantum physics, but that if you think you can picture what's going on in quantum physics, then you don't understand quantum physics. If you think you can draw a picture in your head of what's happening when photons move through a half-silvered mirror, then you haven't really gotten there yet. And this is because, very importantly, it's in quantum physics that we start to reason about things which are by their very nature outside the sphere, the realm of our observation. That's why things start to break down. Once we get to things,
you can't observe things at a quantum level. You have to use inferences. But I mean, that goes back to the discovery of cells by, what was his name? The guy with the L name that I can't pronounce, back into like the 17th century, things that we couldn't actually see, although maybe it's a bit more directly observable. But the idea of science discovering things that we can't directly observe is not unique to quantum mechanics. There's many other examples of this. I don't know that there's anything fundamentally profound about that, other than, hey, yeah, science is cool, right?
In principle observe, because by definition we're not observing them, or we want to know how they act when we're not observing them. It turns out that those things cease to have the properties of an object in space of the kind that we experience in the everyday world.
Yeah, that one.
And there are those who would say that doesn't prove that our consciousness gives them those properties, just that when they enter into our consciousness, they have those properties. But either way, what we're basically saying is the world as we see it and as we experience it is just that. It is the world as we experience it. And outside of us, it takes on very different characteristics. Now, this is all extremely trippy and counter.
So we experience things differently to how they fundamentally are. Yeah, not really that profound. I don't know. Yeah, okay. We experience physical objects as solid, whereas in fact they're mostly empty space. You know, we experience memories as, well, at least sometimes we experience them as sort of fixed and definite, whereas in fact they're in a constant state of flux and reconstruction every time we remember them. At least previously, I don't know if this has changed in recent years with new projector technology, but at least traditionally, when you sit in a theater, a movie theater, you're actually in darkness half the time, because they flash the image and then there's a period of darkness in between each time they flash. It's about half the time you're actually in darkness, but because the frame rate is sufficiently high, you can't actually perceive that. Those are just a few examples of the many ways in which sort of fundamentally reality is very different to how we perceive it. And really this shouldn't be shocking, because we interact with reality through our sense perceptions, and our sense perceptions are limited and they operate at a certain scale and through certain mechanisms and transduction processes, and so they won't manifest all aspects of reality. This really gives me the I'm 14 and this is deep vibes, where it's really not that profound. It's like stuff you should have learned in high school or even middle school, and it's kind of interesting, but you know, you want to move beyond that. It's like, wow, we don't perceive reality exactly as it is.
Intuitive, as you say, but why is it that it leads us back to a much more normal and
yeah, pretty much this is the argument?
Well, because
you can't see Q and fields
back into our minds the idea that form as a property of the mind is actually a constituent part of reality, that matter without mind doesn't have the necessary properties to exist in the sense that we think of things existing. And once
so his argument there seems to be that because consciousness is needed for collapse, then matter without mind would be impossible. Remember that he didn't in any way explain why that's necessary. He asserted that that is a consequence of quantum theory, which it's not. It's a consequence of a very fringe and very implausible interpretation of quantum theory.
To wrap your head around that, you're actually much closer to thinking the way people have been thinking for millennia before the scientific revolution. You're much closer to saying, oh, the world as we experience it isn't just a world of raw material. It's a world of raw material imbued with these supernatural or even just immaterial things like form and logic and reason and
But he hasn't explained how any of those things are imbued in the world, form and logic and meaning. Well, maybe form, unclear what that means exactly, but logic and meaning, he doesn't explain where that fits in at all. That doesn't have anything to do with quantum mechanics. And if by form he just means things having properties and regularities, well, yeah, that's part of how materialists have thought about the world for a long time. What exactly is the problem supposed to be here? Again, the only version of materialism he seems to be critiquing here is a version where the world literally consists of atoms that bump into each other and do nothing else and have no other properties.
Meaning, and all of those things can only exist, so far as we know, in a mind. There is nothing other than a mind that could possibly contain something like a form or a number or a mathematical principle. And so if you want to say that,
yeah, I've already given. So is that true of like the US dollar? Does that only exist in a mind? Because that can be multiply instantiated, and you destroy one instantiation, you haven't destroyed the thing. Because that was the argument about numbers. Because that argument can be applied for all sorts of other things, which plausibly are part of the physical world and are physically manifested, and although we can think about them, are not actually fundamentally the products of minds. Maybe he does want to say that, but that just seems crazy to me.
at the beginning of the world, there were just these bare laws, which is one thing that materialists love to say. I mean, Stephen Hawking said this in the Wall Street Journal, right? Like the world comes into being just with a few bare physical laws. Then you are ultimately thrown back again on saying, well, whose laws? Who wrote them? Where did they?
Oh, my. I'm going to have to go soon because I have something to get to, but I just can't stand this, right? Whose laws? What do you mean whose laws? They're not like laws in a society, my man. Scientific laws are descriptions of how the physical world behaves, which are applicable within certain constraints and certain range of, you know, energies or context or whatever it is, depending on the context. It's not like, I mean, some person derived them or came up with them or postulated them, but in the sense of they pre-exist our discovery of them, they're not anyone's laws. They're just a description of the way nature behaves. What, I just can't even, like, whose laws? What? They're no one's laws, according to the materialists, obviously. They just, that's the way things are. It's just a description of the way things behave in themselves. You know, like, let's go to Newtonian mechanics, right? A massive object travels, well, not any object actually, an object travels in a straight line forever at the same velocity unless acted on by a force. That's a law, right? In Newtonian mechanics. It's not anyone's law. That's just a description of what matter does. So what I'm struggling for words here of how dumb
Exist.
These claims
the
are
only answer can
arguments
be
are.
in some ultimate or primary mind. And
Thanks, Humpty. Appreciate it. There was a fundraiser for you from Digital Gnosis channel for some reason, so here you go. Yeah, it's just because Nathan was trying to help me out with the transition from PhD to hopefully postdoc soon, and I appreciated that. So yeah, there's a link in the description here if anyone wants to make a contribution. Don't feel any obligation to, but yeah, appreciated that. Anyway, so yeah, I'm going to have to go soon. Let's just
this is, again,
quickly
the way that
wrap
most
up
people
here.
have thought about these things for a very long time. And so quantum physics fits perfectly into the ancient Aristotelian picture and Thomistic picture of the world. It doesn't fit so well into the aberration.
Which is interesting because then how come like Thomas Aquinas didn't, or the medievals didn't come up with quantum mechanics if it fits in so well? The answer is it doesn't. They would have no idea about quantum mechanics. It's scientists doing science that came up with it. It's based on mechanistic ideas about interaction and about validating findings experimentally that fundamentally fit into a mechanical, physical universe that operates according to certain regularities, but doesn't need or require or entail the existence of any mind, like beyond human minds at all. It doesn't require human minds either, but obviously we exist in that universe, but it doesn't require a God in any way. In fact, if we found that there were no such underlying principles, perhaps that would point to a mind, because it's like, well, we can't find any regularities at all. Then maybe there's some mentality that keeps reality together. But the fact that we can find these realities and experimentally verify them to very high precision, I think is evidence that there is no need for a mind. Things are just operating in accordance with with their inherent properties and behaviors. That's just how that's what they do. They fields be fields, right? They interact with each other in certain ways. And that gives rise to certain phenomena, and we can describe that scientifically. Laplace was right. We don't have any need for that hypothesis of the divine. And really all Spencer's been doing through this whole video is explaining how that's true. Yes, Laplace was wrong about atomism, right? His science is 200 years out of date. Not surprising, because he lived more than 200 years ago. But he was right that we still have no need for that hypothesis. And every year that goes by, we have even less need for that hypothesis as our understanding of the world increases. Always through scientific developments, and I think also, history and philosophy can add as well, but never through theology and never through apologetics. It's always through thinking about things in a naturalistic material context that actually delivers advances in our understanding. That's obviously my claim, but I think I can defend that. I'm going to have a quick jump around if there's anything else.
Follows the patterns that,
but I feel like it's going to be pretty
refined, articulated in the Genesis story. Genesis story gives us opening up this whole door for theological speculation, because the universe has a beginning, right? And this is something that Stephen Meyer does write about very beautifully. Like, if in fact it is the case that cosmology begins with a day with no yesterday, which is how Lemaitre put it, well then what comes before that? What comes outside of it?
Oh my gosh, I can't. There's a day with no yesterday, and then he asks what comes before it. Spencer, you just said that there's nothing before it. There's no yesterday, right? So nothing comes before it. Like, have you even thought about what you say, Spencer? He literally tells me, hey, these people are saying there's a day with no yesterday. So immediately I ask what comes before it. They just told you nothing comes before it. Did you think before speaking? Like, oh my gosh. Anyway, Big Bang is separate to quantum mechanics.
It's able to escape from matter. And the reason that's important for us is because that's the oldest light that we're able to observe.
Oh,
we can see it in for instance,
radiation.
Old television static has a little bit of this called the cosmic microwave background radiation. You turn on old TV, you'll see light, ancient light from the beginning of the universe, but not from the very beginning. Only from 360,000 years after the beginning of the universe, which means that that whole period before light escaped is blocked off from our observation. There's a radical disjunct, almost as if there was evening and morning the first day.
Oh my God. Okay, I can't do this anymore. He's saying that the time when the universe becomes what's what I'm looking for, transparent to visible light, is the time that makes the first day, like in Genesis, which is like, that's not even, I just can't even, I'm not even going to go through how idiotic that is. It's just not even worth it. All right, thanks everyone for coming. I do need to go now, but I did promise that I would talk about my thesis. So let me just cap this up by saying this video was way worse than I thought it would be. There is almost nothing Spencer said was both sort of specific enough to really assess, and also true. Everything was either so vague as to be impossible to assess, or just wrong and confused. Basically, what he does in this video is define materialism as like early 19th century atomism, but also without properties, like momentum is a problem for some reason. And then says, well, that is not an adequate understanding of the world. Therefore, we should reject materialism. This is one of the biggest examples of a straw man I've ever seen. That's a pretty crazy straw man. And he doesn't actually interact with anyone who has advocated for this position. He just plucks out quotes here and there, mostly from people who are talking about other things. And his understanding of science is either he's terrible at communicating his understanding, or he doesn't understand science at all. Almost every single thing he said about science, not just the quantum causes collapse, but the statistical mechanics point, and his point about momentum somehow being like immaterial, and the Big Bang thing that I just heard and can't even get can't even bring myself to discuss that, how silly that is. Yeah, it's all misconception, misconstrual, misunderstanding. So yeah, this video was terrible. Sean, I'd love to come on and chat about how science reveals a godless universe, or at least talk about some of these issues in a more informed way, hopefully a more nuanced way, and not make sweeping claims without any argument or justification. Spencer, if you want to come on my channel, you're welcome, and you can explain why I'm wrong, and I can explain why you're wrong. We can have a discussion about it. If you think I've misinterpreted your views, you can criticize me and explain how I misunderstood everything that you said. But again, I'm just reacting with what I heard in the video. Maybe the book's better. Haven't read the book. All right. Quick check of chat. Yep. Okay. So I think I just want to now comment on my dissertation. Yeah. So I'm looking to submit this week. It will take a few months to mark after that. So hoping to do a bit more content in that time. My thesis is about the cognitive science and language. So what I do is look at semantics. So that's the study of meaning. So I'm interested in word meaning and sentence meaning. And particularly, I'm interested in what's called compositionality. So this is an idea that we understand the meaning of composite phrases or like sentences by applying certain rules and processing the sentence through those rules and like taking the individual words and putting them together or breaking them down in terms of the rules, like syntactic rules, you can think about it, that make up the sentence. And so this is an idea about how humans are able to think about things that we've never seen before, arbitrary ideas, by basically taking existing components and then piecing them together in accordance with certain rules. We're able to understand novel and creative ideas, right? You can't explain that just by appealing to things that we've experienced in the past, because obviously we can talk about things we've never seen before or heard of before through novel combinations of ideas. And so this is the idea of compositionality. So there's different formal frameworks for understanding that and how it's implemented in like the mind and the brain. So I look at testing those like computational frameworks, particularly relating to large language models. So if you know about ChatGPT, I kind of study models like that, as well as different frameworks. And I study the limitations of large language models in terms of representing sentence meaning in particular, some of their strengths, some of their weaknesses, and compare that to other frameworks. And so my research operates at a level of cognitive science, like behavioral studies of humans making judgments about language, as well as a neuroscience level. So I've done neuroimaging studies of humans reading sentences and looking at the brain representations. So that's what my thesis is about. It does connect up to certain questions that we talk about in Bad Apologetics and my videos sometimes about philosophy of language and meaning, intentionality, philosophy of mind. And so I'm interested in making some more connections between that as well in future videos. So that's what my thesis is about. Thanks everyone for coming, and hopefully you found this interesting. And I will actually make a plug for the next thing that I'm doing, which is a discussion with Nathan and Real Seeker. I think that's his channel name. It's Thursday morning for me. I guess for most listeners that will be Wednesday evening. We'll be talking about the Shroud of Turin, so that will be fun. That's a follow-up to the last Bad Apologetics episode. So check that out if you're interested. Otherwise, I'll be doing more of these videos as always. And take care, everyone. Stay safe, especially with recent political developments in certain places in the world. Hopefully things will go all right. So take care. I'll speak to you soon. Bye.